the city of Rome, mighty, eternal, grand. But this story doesn't take place in the Colosseum or the Senate. No emperors here, no battles, no marble statues. Instead, we drift quietly to a narrow, forgotten alley on the edge of the city, past chickens scratching at cobblestones, past a sleepy old mule tied outside a shuttered bakery, and into a dim, low-ceilinged workshop, where dust floats gently in the air like ancient pollen, and the only sound is the slow scratch of a needle through wool. Inside, a man sits hunched beside a flickering oil lamp. His name is Publius. He is not famous, he is not wealthy, he is not particularly ambitious, but he is a sockmaker. And today, like every day, he is making socks, lumpy, coarse, perfectly itchy, Roman socks. There are no crowds cheering him, no applause, just the creak of his stool and the steady rhythm of wool being sewn into tubes that will warm Roman toes and irritate Roman calves. The air smells of lanolin and smoke. A pile of wool sits in a basket beside him, unwashed, tangled and stubborn. He tugs gently at a clump and begins his work. This is not a tale of glory. This is a tale of texture, of quiet repetition, and the ancient struggle between wool and skin. Now, close your eyes, and imagine you are there in that tiny Roman shop, listening to the soft scratch of thread and the sigh of a man who has sewn the same shape 1,000 times before. This is where our story begins, in the stillness, in the slow, in the sock. The wool used by Publius came from Roman sheep, not the fluffy, cloud-like sheep you might imagine. These sheep were rugged, survivors of mountain cold and country mud. Their wool was thick, stubborn, and anything but soft. Before it ever touched a foot, the wool had already lived a life, brushed against thorn bushes, soaked by rain, caked in dust, and filled with burrs. And yet, it was prized, not for comfort, but for warmth. That was the Roman way: endure discomfort in exchange for durability. In the corner of Publius's shop sits a bundle of this very wool. It looks harmless, innocent, even, but he knows better. He's seen what happens when it brushes skin. He's heard the scratching. He's seen the red marks left behind on noble legs and soldiers' ankles alike. The wool must first be washed in cold water, sometimes with ashes, sometimes vinegar, always with regret. It is then beaten, dried, spun. Each step takes time. Each step releases more dust into the room, which is why Publius always sneezes before lunch. Even after all that effort, the wool fights back. Each fiber is like a tiny wire, ready to prickle, poke, and itch. Still, he threads his needle. Still, he sews. And the Romans, they wear the socks anyway, because the cold is worse, because their sandals don't help, because that's simply what's done. Outside his window, a pair of children run barefoot through the dirt. They laugh. They're too young to need socks, too young to understand the quiet suffering of warm feet and itchy ankles. But one day, they'll come knocking on his door, woolen tubes in hand, and he will patch them, and they will scratch. That's the truth of Roman wool. It warms the foot, it tests the spirit, and it never ever apologizes. Every morning, just after dawn, Publius begins his day the same way. He wakes slowly, scratches one ankle absently under the blanket, and rises with a groan that seems older than he is. His home is simple: stone walls, a wooden cot, a single table, no servants, no family, just him and the sound of pigeons echoing off the nearby rooftops. He eats cold barley porridge. It sticks to the bowl like old plaster. Sometimes he sprinkles salt on top, for variety, but today he forgets, and it tastes exactly like yesterday. When the porridge is gone, he lights a small oil lamp. The flame flickers and leans. Then, quietly, he crosses into his workroom, where the tools of his quiet craft await. The same dull shears, the same curved needle, the same basket of wool, half spun and half suspicious. He sits on his stool, the one with the loose leg that rocks slightly, and sighs. Then he begins. First, the wool is checked for burrs. There are always burrs, tiny thorns caught between fibers. He picks them out one by one, placing them in a tiny clay dish, a dish full of yesterday's thorns. Then comes the spinning. He spins slowly, not with joy, not with boredom either, just with routine. The thread grows in length, in thickness, in potential. Once long enough, he cuts it with a bronze blade. The blade is old, blunt at the tip. It doesn't so much slice as persuade the thread to separate. He threads his needle, he blinks, and then he begins the first stitch. It is not exciting, it is not fulfilling, but it is familiar, and in the quiet rhythm of stitch after stitch, something resembling peace begins to form. Outside, the street slowly wakes, but inside, the only sound is thread sliding through wool, and the occasional sigh of a man who has chosen the path of itches. By midday, the street outside grows louder, vendors shouting, donkeys braying, children chasing each other with sticks far too large. Publius hears none of it. He's inside, stitching a heel that doesn't really fit a heel, but it will have to do. Then, a knock, slow, unenthusiastic, the kind of knock that says, "I'm not really in a hurry." He opens the door. It's Gaius, a customer, a man with bony knees, furrowed brows and socks already in hand. Gaius raises one of them like an accusation. They itch. Publius blinks, then shrugs. "They're supposed to," he replies flatly. Gaius stares, then slowly accepts it. He puts the sock back into the basket and asks for another pair, slightly longer if possible. Publius nods. Another man once tried to argue about the discomfort. He claimed the socks were cursed, said he wore them for 3 days and didn't sleep once. Publius had asked him, calmly, "Was it cold outside?" The man nodded. "Then they worked," Publius replied. "There are no returns. There are no refunds, only quiet acceptance." Another customer, Lucilla, arrives that afternoon. She needs socks for her aging father, something that won't rub his ankles raw, she says. Publius says nothing, just hands her a pair. She doesn't even check them. She knows what she's getting. That's the strange agreement between sockmaker and city. He offers warmth, they accept the itch, and together, they all get through the winter. There's an ancient rivalry that no Roman poet ever sang of, one that never made it into the scrolls of historians, and yet, it was everywhere, at the bathhouses, in the markets, on the roads. The eternal battle between socks and sandals. Roman sandals, caligae, were tough, worn by soldiers and farmers alike. They were made of thick leather straps, nailed soles, and absolutely no sympathy for toes. They were meant to last, but they were never meant to be comfortable. Then came the sock. At first people thought it was absurd. Wool inside a sandal? Blasphemy, madness. But then the winters came, and toes began to turn blue. And suddenly, madness didn't seem so mad. The sock didn't fit easily into the sandal. It bunched up. It folded where it shouldn't. And when you walked, the straps rubbed against the wool, and the wool rubbed against the skin. The result? Warm toes, scratched ankles, blisters, and the quiet, persistent question, was this better than being cold? For most, the answer was probably. They didn't have better options. There was no fleece, no cozy lining, just wool and hope. Some experimented. They cut slits into their socks to let the straps through. Others wrapped cloth around their feet instead. But nothing stopped the itch. It wasn't a problem to solve. It was simply part of life. Publius sometimes made sandal-friendly socks. Shorter, tighter, more painful. He called them city socks, because only someone in a city would pretend they were a good idea. Even the soldiers of the north, marching through snow and sleet, wore their socks inside their sandals with quiet resignation. It was not stylish, it was not dignified, but it was survival. And in Rome, as in all things, survival came first. Comfort came never. The workshop is quiet again. The rush of midday has passed. The sun drifts lower, casting long shadows across the floor, and the smell of warmed wool hangs thick in the air. Publius leans forward on his stool. His fingers move slowly, methodically. Thread through wool. Pull, tighten, knot, thread through wool. Again and again. The rhythm is ancient. But no matter how careful he is, no matter how smooth the stitch, the sock still itches. There is something eternal in the wool, something that refuses to be tamed. Each fiber, once part of a sheep's winter coat, still remembers the wind, still remembers the mud, still remembers the need to resist. Some blame the wool itself, some say it's the lanolin, others insist it's the dye, especially that deep red color made from crushed beetles. Publius has tried everything, boiling the wool, rinsing it in river water, soaking it in olive oil, one time, even wine. Nothing helped. The itch was stubborn. It lived between the threads. It clung to the sock like memory. And yet the people still came, because even an itchy sock was better than none. He recalls one man, a baker, who once walked 10 miles through the rain. His sandals slipped. His socks were soaked. He arrived with blisters, limping and wincing, but all he said was, Can you make me another pair? These ones don't itch as much as the last. And that, perhaps, is the true art of Roman sock making. Not to make them soft, not to make them perfect, but to make them slightly less unbearable. Publius smiles faintly, ties another knot, and sets the sock aside, ready for its next victim. Far beyond the city of Rome, beyond the markets and the marble statues, beyond the vineyards and the hills, lies the cold edge of the empire, Germania, a land of thick forests, endless mud and merciless winters. It is there that one of Publius's socks made its journey. He remembers the order well. A soldier had come to his workshop, young, broad-shouldered, smelling of leather and wet iron. He had orders to march north within the week, and he needed warmth. 2 pairs, he said. No frills, just warm. Publius handed them over. Simple, grey, thick with extra stitching. He never expected to hear from the man again. Most of his socks were never seen once they left the city. But weeks later a scroll arrived, folded neatly, sealed with a thumbprint of wax. The handwriting was rough, but the message, unforgettable. Your socks reached me. They itch like cursed wool, wrapped in fire ants, but my toes are not black, so thank you. Publius had laughed once, the only time he'd ever laughed at a letter. He still keeps it tucked behind a broken beam near the ceiling. That sock had traveled over mountains, through frozen rivers, across enemy lines. It had rubbed against armored calves and bootstraps. It had witnessed snow, blood, and boredom, but it had endured, and more importantly, it had itched. To this day, Publius considers it his finest work, not because it brought comfort, but because it survived. In the quiet war between man and cold, the sock had done its part. Now, as the afternoon light dims, Publius ties a new stitch. He wonders, briefly, where this one might end up, and who, far from here, might one day curse his name under their breath, while rubbing their calf in the snow. Just as the golden edge of sunlight begins to fade from the windowsill, shadow falls across Publius's door. He doesn't look up. He knows that knock, it's always the same. 3 soft taps, then one hesitant pause, a rhythm that belongs only to Lucilla. She steps inside, her sandals brushing the dust from the floor. A woolen shawl wraps around her shoulders, and her arms carry a basket. Empty, for now. Her eyes scan the room. They always do, like she expects it to have changed since yesterday. It never does. I need another pair, she says. Publius nods. For your father again? She shakes her head. No, for me this time. She looks embarrassed, like she's just admitted something deeply personal. And in a way, she has. His old ones are still holding, she adds. Still itching, too. Publius reaches for a finished pair. Plain, grey, reliable. She hesitates. Do you have anything softer? He pauses. There's always this moment. The hope, the possibility, the belief that maybe, just maybe, this time, the wool has changed. He shakes his head gently, not softer, but warmer. Lucilla sighs, then smiles. I suppose that will do. She places a small bronze coin on the table. He pretends not to notice it. She pretends not to notice that he always gives her the better pair. As she leaves, her sandals make the same soft sound on the stone. The door closes, and Publius is alone again. But the basket isn't empty anymore, and somewhere tonight, another Roman will scratch behind the knee, with feet that are warmer than before. Not every sock made by Publius found its way to a foot. Some stayed in the shop too small, or too stiff. Others were bartered away, left half-finished when the needle broke. But a few, a quiet, unlucky few, simply never left the shelf. In the far corner of his workshop, there is a wooden crate, unlabeled, covered in dust, and inside lay the forgotten pairs that were sewn during long, silent winters, pairs meant for customers who never returned, a traveling priest who vanished on the road to Ostia, a widow who promised to come back with payment, but never did, a soldier who changed his mind and chose sandals instead. One pair is particularly odd, short, lopsided, stitched with a strange green thread. Publius never used again, too tight around the toes, too loose at the calf. They sit curled like sleeping mice at the bottom of the box. Sometimes, on especially quiet days, Publius opens the crate, not to sell, not to wear, just to look. He runs his fingers across the old wool. Some of it has stiffened, other parts have softened strangely with time. They are imperfect, useless perhaps, but they carry stories, stories that were almost told. A sock that almost walked the streets of Rome, another that might have trudged through the mud of Gaul, and one that could have warmed the foot of someone long forgotten. He closes the lid gently. The dust stirs, then settles. In Rome, even the unwanted has a place. Even the unused is part of the world, and the socks that were never worn. They rest quietly, still waiting, still ready to itch. The sun has dipped behind the rooftops now. Shadows stretch longer across the stone streets of Rome. The chatter of the market fades, and the sound of hooves on cobblestone grows sparse. Inside the little workshop, the oil lamp sputters gently, casting amber light across the walls. The glow dances on the wool pile, on the dull scissors, and on the face of Publius, calm, lined, and quietly tired. He rubs his eyes. The day has been long. 6 pairs made, 2 customers served, only 1 complaint, a personal best. He stands slowly, his knees crack, his back protests. But there's no hurry, there never is. He places the last sock of the day beside its twin. They don't match exactly. One is longer at the toe, the other slightly tighter at the cuff. But they'll do. They always do. He wipes the table clean with a cloth, tucks away the needle, and pinches the oil lamp's wick to extinguish the flame. Darkness settles like a blanket. For a moment, he simply stands there, listening. To the quiet hum of the city preparing for night, to the breeze slipping under the door, to the faint rustle of wool shifting in the basket, as if it too is settling in. This is his favorite time. Not because it's over, but because nothing more is required of him. Tomorrow, he'll stitch again. Tomorrow, he'll hear more complaints, more sighs, and more requests for something softer that doesn't exist. But tonight, there is no needle in his hand, no customer at the door, only the silence of the socks and the soft comfort of routine. He steps outside, looks up at the Roman sky, dim stars pricking the dusk, and with a small tired breath, Publius goes home, leaving the shop behind him, leaving the itch behind him, at least until morning. In ancient Rome, there were many things a person could avoid. Taxes, if you knew the right senator, fights, if you walked the long way around the forum, and even bad wine, if you knew who watered it down. But there was one thing no one could escape: the itch. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't deadly, but it was always there. It crept along the inside of the sock, starting like a whisper near the ankle, then crawling upward like a forgotten insect, making its home behind the knee. No amount of shifting stopped it, no shaking of the leg, no tugging at the cuff. The itch remained, persistent, mysterious, and patient. Some Romans scratched openly. Others did it discreetly, mid-conversation, wiggling their foot behind a column or beneath a table. Some developed elaborate walking patterns, just to lessen the contact between sock and skin, and still they wore them. Publius once asked a customer, a cook from across the river, red-faced and flustered from the heat of his own kitchen, why not go without? The man had stared at him for a moment, then said quietly, because cold toes are worse. That was the truth of it. No one loved the socks, but they loved the alternative, even less, and so the itch was tolerated, accepted, inherited like a family recipe, passed down from father to son, along with the warning, don't scratch too hard or you'll tear the wool. Publius had once tried to fix it, tried carding the wool differently, tried lining the socks with cloth, even tried a secret blend of olive oil and beeswax. All failed. The itch remained, not because he wasn't skilled, but because some things are simply meant to be lived with. In Rome, they called that fortitudo, strength in the face of small miseries. And in every Roman household, that strength began at the feet. There was one sock, only one, that Publius ever made. That did not itch. It was an accident. He never meant to make it. It began with a delivery, a rare bundle of imported wool, lighter, smoother, almost silky, brought in from the eastern provinces. A merchant had no use for it and traded it for a half loaf of bread. Publius examined the fibers. They were different, thin, slippery. They didn't puff up like Roman wool. They didn't bite at his fingers. They simply yielded. Curious, he spun the thread slowly, delicate but strong. Then he stitched, not with his usual firm tug, but gently, cautiously, as if the sock might vanish mid-stitch. When it was done, he held it in both hands. It looked wrong. It draped like cloth, not like armor. It smelled clean, no sharp bite of sheep or smoke. He tried it on, and for the first time in his life, there was no itch, only warmth, only quiet. It was, in every sense, perfect, and he hated it. It didn't feel Roman, it didn't feel earned. There was no friction, no resistance, no reminder that comfort was something you paid for in scratches. He took it off, held it in the dim light, stared at it for a long, thoughtful moment, then folded it and placed it in the crate in the back, the one where the unwanted socks go. That sock was never sold, never worn, never spoken of again, because in Rome, a sock that doesn't itch isn't a sock at all. For a brief stretch of time, Publius was not alone in his workshop. His name was Marcus, young, curious, not particularly skilled, but always asking questions. He had come from a family of potters, but disliked the feel of clay beneath his nails. Wool, he said, felt cleaner. Publius had simply grunted. On his first day, Marcus tried to spin thread. It tangled, then snapped, then caught on fire when he dropped it too close to the lamp. On his second day, he tried to sew. The sock he made was wide at the top, narrow at the toe, and somehow had 3 seams. Publius held it up, turned it in his hand. "It's unique," Marcus offered. "It's itchy," Publius replied. Still, he didn't throw it out. He didn't even correct it. He placed it beside the others, and to Marcus's surprise, a customer bought it the very next day, said it fit his foot like a glove. A very uncomfortable glove. Encouraged, Marcus made more. All were crooked, all were itchy, all somehow sold. He never mastered symmetry, but he mastered persistence, which in sock making is worth more than straight lines. He stayed with Publius for a few seasons, long enough to learn the rhythm, the routine, the quiet acceptance of imperfection. One morning, he was gone, left only a note, gone to Athens, to study comfort. Publius stared at the note for a long time, then turned it over, used the back to write down measurements for a new order. Sometimes, he thinks of Marcus, of the crooked sock, of the boy who believed that maybe, just maybe, socks didn't always have to itch, but then he picks up his needle, and the moment passes. On the western wall of a bathhouse in Subura, one of Rome's noisiest, dustiest neighborhoods, there's a bit of graffiti scratched into the plaster. It reads, simply, "Woolen socks are a quiet curse." No name, no date, just those 6 words, carved with the tip of something sharp, half hidden behind a worn column near the steam room. Publius didn't write it, but he visited the bathhouse once, and he saw it there, faded but legible, and he smiled, because someone else had understood, someone else had worn the itch, and remembered it well enough to leave a mark. Graffiti in Rome was common, declarations of love, boasts of victory, mockery of neighbors. But this was something softer, not angry, not proud, just tired. He wondered who wrote it. A soldier, a cook, a priest with sore feet. He imagined a man, just out of the bath, steam rising from his shoulders, his socks lying on a stone bench nearby, still damp, still itchy, waiting to reclaim his legs with every terrible thread. And in that moment, armed with only a rusty nail and a short temper, he carved a truth into history. A truth Publius had always known, but never said aloud. That warmth comes with a cost. That comfort in Rome was never complete, and that sometimes a sock can say more than a poem. He never told anyone he saw the words, but sometimes, late at night, he would whisper them under his breath while sewing. "Woolen socks are a quiet curse," and then, keep stitching. At the edge of the Aventine Hill, where stone steps curve like folded parchment, and ivy climbs the cracked walls of forgotten shrines, there stands a small, aging temple. It is not grand, no golden statues, no marble columns with etched victories, just a place of quiet offerings, to minor gods with minor responsibilities. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, a priest entered the temple to clean the altar, and there, lying at the base of a stone pedestal, was a sock, grey, woolen, folded with care. At first he thought it had been dropped, but there was no one else nearby, no footprints in the dust, no coins, no note, just the sock. It wasn't new. The stitching had frayed at the toe, the cuff curled slightly like parchment left in damp air, but it was intact, used, appreciated, and now offered. To whom, exactly, no one knows. Perhaps to Somnus, the god of sleep, or to Febris, goddess of fevers and chills, or maybe to no god at all, just an act of hope, from someone with cold feet and tired prayers. The sock remained for days, unmoved, undisturbed. The priests whispered about it. Some said it was a curse, others a joke, but most agreed it felt honest. Eventually, a bird stole it, pulled it apart thread by thread, carried bits to build a nest somewhere in the rafters. And so, piece by piece, the offering became something else, something useful, something warm, something woven into the quiet architecture of the world. Back in his shop, Publius never learned of the temple sock, but perhaps on certain days, when the thread behaved and the wool felt a little softer, he sensed something had been received. There was a rumor, passed quietly between weavers and old women with sore feet, that somewhere, somehow, there existed a way to make socks less itchy. Not soft, not luxurious, just slightly more bearable. And so, like all ancient mysteries, a recipe began to form, not written on scrolls, but whispered in steam rooms and mumbled behind market stalls. Publius had heard pieces of it, one step from a merchant, another from a shepherd, a third from an old blind spinner who swore by her method, then promptly forgot it. Still, he tried. Step 1. Soak the wool in cold spring water, at dawn before the sun hits the hills. Some said this calms the fibers, others said it was nonsense, but Publius did it anyway. Step 2. Add ashes from olive wood to the water, never fig, never pine, olive only. It must rest overnight. The smell, terrible. The effect, unknown. Step 3. After rinsing, rub the wool with crushed rose petals, not for softness, for scent. Some believe the skin forgave a sock if it smelled like spring. Step 4. Card the wool, not with iron, but with combs made from bone, gentler, though much slower. Step 5. Spin the thread by hand, without tension, let it twist as it wishes. Some say this gives the sock a freedom of spirit. Publius wasn't sure what that meant, but he did it anyway. Final step. Stitch only during the quietest part of the day, when birds stop chirping, and the street outside is briefly, impossibly still. That day the socks he made felt different. Not soft, but not harsh. A local baker bought them, came back 2 days later. They still itch, he said, but only a little. Publius nodded, then carefully wrote a single word on the inside cuff of the next sock. Hope. It didn't stop the itch, but it made it slightly easier to wear. Some days are meant to test a man. Not with war, not with fire, but with something slower, wetter, colder, rain. It began before dawn, a soft tapping on the tile roof, then heavier, then endless. Publius had hung 12 socks outside the shop the night before, freshly stitched, waiting to dry in the warm evening air. But Rome had other plans. By the time he stepped outside, the socks were soaked, dripping from the eaves, clinging to the wooden pegs like limp slugs. He gathered them carefully, one by one. Each made a heavy splat as he dropped it into the basket. Wool, when wet, has a smell, a deep, musty scent, like old bread and forgotten cellars. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. Inside, he laid them near the hearth, not too close. Wet wool near flame is dangerous and smoky, and so for hours, the shop was filled with steam and the smell of damp wool, and the kind of silence that wraps around your shoulders like a wet cloak. As the socks dried, they stiffened. Not soft, not flexible. They curled and crisped at the edges, like old parchment. He touched one. It scratched his finger. A good sign. It meant they were almost ready. By sunset, the socks were dry again, warped, misshapen. Each one now carried a memory of the storm. The next day, a customer bought a pair, said they fit tighter than usual, said the left one made a strange crinkling sound when he walked. Publius just nodded. The rain, he said, like it explained everything. And in a way, it did, because even in a city of emperors, sometimes you just have to sell wet socks. One grey afternoon, when the clouds hung low over the rooftops of Rome, and the scent of rain still lingered on the stone, a man arrived at the shop, wearing no shoes and no socks. He was older, though not frail. His beard was thick, streaked with ash and time. His robes were simple, but clean, and his feet, dusty, calloused, quiet. He didn't speak at first, just stood at the doorway, looking at the piles of wool, the needles, the half-finished sock draped over the bench. Publius looked up, raised an eyebrow, then gestured to the stool. The man sat. For a long while, they said nothing. Then, the philosopher spoke. "I have walked the streets of Rome for 40 years, he said. I have spoken of ethics, of freedom, of the soul." He looked down at his bare feet. "And yet, everyone only ever asks why I don't wear socks." Publius nodded slowly. It was a fair question. The man chuckled. "It is not discomfort I avoid, but the reminder of discomfort, the constant whisper, the soft protest of the skin, the itch." He leaned closer. "There is honesty in cold, but an itchy sock, That's betrayal. Publius smirked, then offered him a pair, thick, heavy, with uneven stitching at the heel. The philosopher took them, held them in his hands like ancient scrolls. These, he said, feel like a moral dilemma. He didn't buy them, didn't try them on. He just stood, set them gently back on the bench, and walked out. His feet left faint prints on the dusty floor, proof that for a brief moment, philosophy met wool, and chose the wind instead. Publius watched him go, then picked up the socks, and placed them gently in a drawer labeled "For Thinkers," in the heart of the city, where voices echoed between towering columns, where debates rose like thunder, and pigeons fluttered from statue to statue. Someone dropped a sock, just one, grey, slightly worn at the heel. It lay curled near the base of a fountain, not far from where orators shouted about grain taxes and public virtue. For hours, no one touched it. A merchant passed, arms full of figs. He glanced but moved on. Two children kicked a wooden ball nearby. It bounced once against the sock, then rolled away. A senator walked by. He sniffed, adjusted his toga, and stepped around it as though it were contagious. Even a dog, old and limping, sniffed it, then looked away, unimpressed. There it sat, a single woolen reminder that no matter how great the empire, there were still socks, and they still ended up alone. At midday, a breeze stirred. The sock shifted slightly, then stopped. Later, a beggar approached. He crouched beside it, tilted his head, then, slowly, picked it up, turned it over, and tucked it gently into his robe. He didn't have a matching one, didn't care. For someone with bare feet, even half a sock was a gift from the gods. No one applauded, no one noticed, except maybe the statue of Cicero, which gazed silently over the scene, stone eyes frozen in eternal judgment. And thus, the sock left the forum, carried away not by glory, but by quiet necessity, and somewhere, on a straw mat, tucked into an alley, one foot would be warm tonight, slightly itchy, but warm. Dusk slips gently into Rome, not with drama, but with the slow dimming of windows and the soft hush of voices heading home. In the sock shop, the lamp is lit again, its little flame fluttering like a heartbeat in the heavy stillness of evening. Publius moves quietly, not because he must, but because the quiet invites it. The workshop smells of singed wool and dust, the kind of smell that clings to the walls, to clothes, to memory. On the workbench sits a half-finished sock, still attached to its needle. The thread curls like a sleepy snake across the wood. Publius doesn't rush. The night is his. There will be no visitors now, just him, and the slow companionship of repetition. He threads the needle once more, watches it pass through the cloth, pulls, tightens, breaths. Outside, a dog barks in the distance, a cart rattles over loose stones, and somewhere, a woman sings a lullaby, the tune barely audible above the rising breeze. He stops for a moment, listens, and smiles. Then, gently, he folds the finished sock, places it beside its partner, not identical, not perfect, but together. He lights another small lamp, then begins sweeping the floor. Wool clumps and thread ends gather like soft snow near the corners. Before bed, he opens the crate in the back, looks over the forgotten pairs, the soft one, the crooked one, the rain-warped one. He doesn't touch them, just acknowledges their presence, their small, imperfect place in history. Then, with one last glance around the room, he dims the flame and leaves the shop to its slumber. And behind him, in the still, warm air, 12 pairs of socks wait in silence, ready for feet, ready for winter, ready to itch. There is a kind of object that lingers, that refuses to vanish, even when its threads begin to loosen, and its shape forgets what it was meant to be. One such object was a sock, not particularly special, not soft, not beautiful, just grey, worn, and shaped like a tired question. Publius made it for a man named Silvanus, a builder, thick-fingered and always scowling. He needed a pair for a journey north. Nothing fancy, he had said, just something to keep the frost from chewing my toes. Publius had nodded and stitched him the usual. Years passed, then decades. Publius forgot the name, the face, the order, but somewhere in a village outside Mediolanum, that same sock, tattered and mended again and again, was still being worn by Silvanus's son, then by his daughter, then by a cousin who inherited a drawer full of old clothes. Each time, it was patched, at the heel, at the cuff, at the seam that always split, no matter how carefully it was stitched. Eventually, it stopped looking like a sock, more like a suggestion of one, a symbol. They didn't wear it for warmth anymore. They kept it for tradition. It was brought out each winter, hung near the hearth, not as decoration, but as reminder that someone once endured, that something once lasted. That warmth doesn't always mean comfort, and comfort doesn't always come easy. No one remembered the name of the maker. No one knew it came from a quiet shop in Rome. But in the threads, worn thin and shining like spider silk, a story remained, a soft rebellion against cold, a grey thread through generations, an itch that had become legacy. There were festivals for everything in ancient Rome: the harvest, the moon, the goddess of door hinges. Even public toilets had their day of honor. So it was only a matter of time before someone suggested a festival for socks. It began, as many odd ideas do, with wine. A merchant named Latius, known more for his ambition than his taste, had a surplus of wool socks no one wanted. Desperate to sell them, he gathered a few neighbors, offered spiced wine and pickled olives, and declared the first annual Day of the Foot. There were banners, poorly stitched. There was a song, mostly humming, and there was, unfortunately, a contest. Who could wear the itchiest pair of socks, the longest? People laughed at first. They tied bundles of the worst wool Publius had ever spun, raw, unwashed, still smelling faintly of sheep and damp cave walls. They danced, they scratched, they limped. Children watched in horror. Old women shook their heads. Publius was invited, but declined. "I make the socks," he said. "I don't wear them for sport." By midday, several contestants had abandoned the effort. One man claimed to have seen visions. Another removed his socks, dropped them in the fountain, and left the city. By sunset, the wine was gone. The contest was forgotten. The banner caught fire when someone leaned too close with a torch. The next morning, Rome carried on, as if the sock festival had never happened, and it never did again. Latius returned to selling sandals, and in his little shop, Publius sewed in peace, grateful that, for once, someone else had been blamed for the itch. The Mediterranean, blue as old glass, endlessly shifting beneath Roman sails. It carried merchants and messengers, soldiers and spices, and once it carried a sock, not on a noble ship, not with treasure or maps, but tucked quietly in a wooden crate full of kitchen pots and barley. It had been ordered by a merchant from Crete, one who claimed Roman wool was warmer than anything made on his windy island. Publius didn't ask questions. He simply stitched, double-layered, tightly bound, with a little extra length at the cuff. It was sealed in a crate, alongside spoons, dried lentils, and a cracked amphora. And then it sailed. Days passed, then storms. The sea tossed and rolled, salt stinging every crevice. Somewhere along the way, the crate cracked open. The sock, still folded, still stubborn, slipped loose, and for a moment, floated, just a grey woolen scrap drifting between waves, as dolphins sang beneath it and seabirds circled above. Eventually, it washed ashore on a quiet beach in Cyprus, found by a fisherman. He thought it was a sea sponge at first, then turned it over, saw the stitch, the shape, the faint smell of vinegar and Roman smoke. He took it home, hung it over a rope. It dried in the sun, shrank slightly, hardened like driftwood, and for the next 3 winters, he wore it on only one foot, always the left. He never knew where it came from, never knew the name of the man who made it, but in the sock's scratch and stubbornness, he felt something familiar. He called it his storm sock, because it had survived, just like him. In a quiet street near the southern wall of Rome, there lived a widow named Valeria. She rarely left her home, didn't sell anything, didn't barter, didn't speak much, but everyone in the neighborhood knew one thing. If your sock had a hole, she could fix it. She wasn't trained, never apprenticed, never worked a loom, but her mending needle, short, crooked, carved from bone, was sharper than most memories. People would drop off bundles at her door, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes tied with string, always with hope. The socks came in all shapes. Some were too short, others too long, some so riddled with holes that it was easier to stitch the hole than the sock itself. Valeria worked at night, sitting near a low flame, squinting through bad light and bad thread. She never hurried. Each stitch was a pause, each patch a small decision. Wool over wool, patience over frustration. She had once been married to a soldier. His feet were always cold. She learned to fix socks, because he never learned to stop wearing holes into them. After he passed, she kept the habit. One winter, Publius heard of her. Curious, he sent her a pair, intentionally flawed, frayed at the toe, split at the heel. She returned them a week later, perfectly mended, not softer, not newer, but stronger. He never met her, never spoke a word, but from then on, every sock he sent to the southern wall carried a little tag, stitched in red, for Valeria. And so, stitch by stitch, two lives became entwined, the maker and the mender, separated by silence, but connected by wool. It was the middle of winter, and the cold had settled over Rome like an old creaking blanket. Even the pigeons fluffed their feathers tighter, perched motionless along the temple eaves. That night, wrapped in a woolen cloak, Publius fell asleep earlier than usual, and for the first time in years, he dreamed, not of socks, not of wool, but of something stranger. He dreamed of a room, vast and white, a floor that shined like marble, but gave underfoot like straw. There were no walls, only shelves, endless rows of them, and on every shelf were socks, not grey, not brown, but every colour the mind could imagine. Red as pomegranates, blue as a summer sky, green like olive leaves after rain. Some were thick and ribbed, others thin, almost silk-like. Not a single one was frayed. He walked past them slowly. His sandals made no sound. Then he reached a table, and there, folded perfectly, like an offering, was one of his. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands. It was soft, too soft. There was no weight, no pull, no stubbornness in the thread. It frightened him, in the quiet way that dreams sometimes do. He looked around. No one was there. No customers, no needles, no mending pile, just silence. Then, he woke. His hands were cold. His blanket had slipped from his shoulders, and beside him, on the bench, lay the sock he'd meant to finish yesterday. Rough, stiff, real. He picked it up, ran his fingers along the seam, felt a prickle near the toe. And for the first time that morning, he smiled, because in dreams, socks were perfect, but in Rome, they were honest. His name was Tullius, 7 years old. All knees, elbows and opinions. He lived just down the street from Publius, a blur of dirt-smudged cheeks and sandal slaps on stone, and he hated socks. His mother tried everything. She pleaded, she threatened, she even promised honeyed dates if he'd just keep them on until lunch. But every morning, without fail, she'd find a pair of woolen socks abandoned, stuffed behind the door, tucked into a breadbasket, or once, curled inside the mouth of the family's sleeping goat. They itch, he said simply, as if that explained everything. And to him, it did. He'd rather brave the cold, feet turning pink in the morning frost, than endure the crawl of wool up his leg. One day, in desperation, his mother dragged him into Publius's shop. He stood, arms crossed, glaring at the sockmaker like he was a general of discomfort. Publius said nothing at first, just looked at the boy, then offered him a stool. Tullius didn't sit. Publius lifted a half-finished sock from his bench. Let the boy touch the thread. He flinched. Then, slowly, curiosity crept in. "What's that part?" the boy asked. "That," Publius said. "That's the seam. It always itches first." Tullius squinted. "You know it itches." "Oh yes," Publius replied. "That's how you know it's working." "Working? It's fighting the cold," he said. "The itch is the battle. Your foot is winning." The boy blinked, thought for a long moment, then nodded, once. The next day, he wore the socks. He scratched his ankles, of course, scowled the whole way to school, but he wore them, and a week later, he came to the shop again, this time with a hole in the heel and a single request: "Make it itchier, so I know I'm winning." Publius laughed, and for once, stitched with a little extra thread. She arrived at the shop near twilight, cloaked in a thick shawl, her sandals worn thin, her steps quiet, but purposeful. Publius looked up from his workbench. She didn't speak at first, just held up her hand, and in it, one sock, old, frayed, folded with care. "This is the only one I have," she said. Her voice was calm, not embarrassed, not apologetic. "It belonged to my husband," she added. "He wore it every winter, even when it fell apart, even after he passed." Publius nodded slowly. She didn't ask for a new pair. She didn't ask for the other one. She asked for one thing only: "Can you fix it?" He took the sock gently, unfolded it on the bench. It was soft from years of wear, but strong in strange places. The toe nearly threadbare, but the cuff still tight. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He turned the sock inside out, found old stitches, some his own, others mended by less practiced hands. He imagined her sitting by the fire, threading a dull needle through wool, trying to keep the cold from his toes, long after he was gone. Publius worked by lamplight, small stitches, quiet fixes. He didn't repair the sock to look new, he repaired it to remember. When it was done, he folded it once more, just as she had, and handed it back. She nodded, didn't say thank you, didn't need to. Some stories don't need words, just one sock, and a little care. They were just socks. Simple, plain, made on a mild spring day, with ordinary wool and an ordinary thread. But from the moment Publius stitched the final knot, they stayed together. He always made socks in pairs, but these two, they had something else, a stubbornness, a quiet loyalty. No matter where they went, no matter how many feet they warmed, they were never apart. First, they were worn by a baker, who always folded them carefully at the end of each day. He called them his market socks. They kept him company through early mornings, sticky floors, and the scent of rising dough. When the heel wore thin, he passed them to his brother, a fisherman who tied them with string when they sagged. They saw storms, salt spray, and the inside of a leaky boat near Ostia. When one sock snagged on a nail and tore, he didn't toss it. He stitched it with a fishbone and twine, crude but faithful. Years later, they were found in a trunk, folded beside a faded tunic and a dried laurel leaf. A young boy took them, a student with ink-stained fingers and cold toes. He wore them on exam days, believing they brought him luck. They outlasted sandals, outlasted owners, passed from hand to hand like a secret, never separated, never alone. Even when one grew thinner than the other, even when one was patched 5 times more, they stayed tied together by a faded red thread, a mark Publius had sewn absent-mindedly into the cuff. And when, finally, they could no longer be worn, when the wool thinned to memory, someone placed them beneath a floorboard, wrapped in cloth, safe and still together. And there, in the dark warmth of the earth, they remained. Not because they were useful, not because they were rare, but because they had done the most remarkable thing any pair of socks could ever do. They stayed. The Roman Senate, a chamber of echoes and ambition, marble floors, bronze doors, and voices that carried like thunder across stone. It was not a place for small things, not for sandals, not for socks, and certainly not for scratching. But one day, on a cold morning, when breath curled in the air, and senators wrapped their togas a little tighter, a quiet sound interrupted the business of the empire. Scratch, scratch, pause. Then again, scratch. It came from Senator Elias, a proud man, sharp-witted, never lost an argument in 20 years. But this day, his socks had betrayed him. He shifted in his seat, crossed one leg, then the other, pressed his calf against the bench. Nothing helped. As a debate raged about grain imports from Africa, Elias leaned forward and discreetly reached beneath his toga to scratch his shin. But the marble benches, they echoed. Across the hall, heads turned. The speaker paused. Elias froze. Someone coughed, to cover a laugh. He straightened his robes, raised his chin, and declared, without a hint of irony, "It is the burden of leadership to suffer in silence." The room nodded, as if this was wisdom, but beneath the table, his foot twitched, still battling the enemy within his wool. Later that day, he sent his servant to Publius's shop, not for a refund, not for an apology, just a note, 6 words, written in charcoal on a scrap of parchment. "Make the next pair less aggressive." Publius read it, smiled, then stitched the same pattern as before. Because some men wear togas, some carry scrolls, but all are equal before the itch. Fires in Rome were not rare. The city was built close, wood above stone, cloth against clay, and when flames began, they moved like rumor. This one started in a bakery, a forgotten ember, a dry basket of kindling, and then smoke, shouting, crackling timber. The fire swept through 2 streets before it was stopped. Men threw buckets from rooftops. Women carried children through the haze. Goats fled in every direction. When it was over, ash blanketed the stones, walls blackened, homes ruined. But amid the ruins, in the corner of a charred doorway, half buried beneath a beam, was a sock, not burned, not even singed, just dusty. A single grey sock, curled at the toe, cradled in the ash like an offering. The home had belonged to an old woman named Livia. No family, no servants, just quiet habits and a fondness for wool. Publius remembered her. She once ordered 3 pairs, all identical, all worn inside wooden sandals she refused to give up. She never returned after the fire. But someone, a boy from the neighborhood, found the sock when sifting through the rubble. He held it up like treasure. His mother almost threw it away, but he insisted, and that winter he wore it, on one foot, every day. He said it was lucky, said it kept the cold from biting his heel, even when his other foot ached from the frost. Publius never knew the sock survived, never knew it lived beyond the fire, but somewhere, tucked into a child's boot, one grey woolen survivor carried the warmth of memory, the scent of smoke, the silence of loss, and the miracle of still being something. In a quiet villa near the edge of the Aventine Hill, hidden behind a faded curtain and beneath a cedar shelf holding cracked clay pots, there was a drawer. It didn't look like much, just wood, softened by time and swollen from years of damp air. The handle was missing, the hinges groaned, and yet, inside that drawer was a history, not of Rome, but of feet and warmth, and years that moved slowly, but never stopped. It belonged to a man named Caecilius, a retired clerk, not famous, not forgotten, just quiet. He had kept every pair of socks he'd ever worn, not because he needed them, but because he couldn't throw them away. Each one folded with care, some stacked, others rolled, most with labels, faded scraps of parchment tied with fraying string. Year of the floods, first winter after Julia left, the month the bakery burned. Socks that had holes, socks patched with mismatched thread, socks that had once been white but now leaned brownish grey. Not one was thrown away. To Caecilius, they were not garments. They were chapters. The drawer smelled faintly of wool and rosemary. He kept a sprig inside, said it kept the mice away. When he grew older and his walks became shorter, he'd open the drawer sometimes, not to take anything out, just to remember. The feel of certain winters, the scratch of early mornings, the comfort of knowing he'd made it through. When he passed, the villa was sold. The new owners found the drawer, considered tossing it all. But something, some small tug of curiosity or reverence, made them keep it. And now in a back room, that drawer still rests. A museum of ordinary things, of fabric and years, of silence, survival, and socks. Some socks are made in daylight, when the world hums with noise and hands move quickly, guided by routine and repetition. But not these. This pair was stitched slowly, in the still hours of the night, by the soft flicker of a single candle, as rain tapped gently against the roof. Publius had stayed late that evening, not for a customer, not for coin, but because something inside him whispered, just one more pair. The day had been long. Wool wouldn't cooperate. The thread snapped twice. His fingers ached. But the candle burned steadily, its light dancing over the curve of his tools, and the fine thread held between cracked fingertips. Each stitch felt heavier than the last, not from effort, but from intention. He wasn't thinking about sales, or matching sizes, or who would wear them. He was simply making. The workshop was silent, save for the occasional hiss of the candle and the faint creak of his stool. Outside, the rain whispered like old parchment being turned. He didn't rush, didn't check the time, just moved forward, stitch by stitch, loop by loop, until the wool formed its familiar shape. By the time the second sock was finished, the candle was nothing but a stub, its final flicker trembling on the edge of darkness. Publius sat back, cracked his knuckles, and looked at the pair. They were imperfect, of course, the toe slightly bent, the cuff a bit uneven, but there was something in them, a softness, not found in the wool, but in the hour. He wrapped them in a scrap of cloth, no tag, no price, and placed them quietly in the crate of odd socks, where they waited, not to be sold, but to be found. Because some things aren't made for markets, they're made for moments, and memories, and the hush of candlelight. Winter, when it arrived in the northern provinces, did not knock. It broke the door down, snow drifted over fields, rivers froze in silence, and men wrapped their feet in whatever they could find. Some used furs, some tied straw with leather cords, some, if they were lucky, had woolen socks from Rome. There was a soldier, young, quiet, homesick. He'd been posted to a stone outpost near the edge of the empire, where the wind bit harder than the steel on his belt. Before he left, his sister had bought him a pair of socks from a merchant who traded with Publius. Thick wool, double-stitched, unremarkable to look at, but packed carefully into his satchel like a secret weapon. The first snow came early that year, caught the outpost unprepared. Tents collapsed, hearths struggled, frost crept into boots by dawn. But the soldier wore his socks every night, every march, every watch beneath the frozen stars. They itched, of course, so much so that he carved a stick to scratch the back of his calves without removing his armor. But they kept his feet dry and warm and alive. Then one morning, he rose to find the snow had deepened overnight, blanketed everything in silence. In the scramble to break camp, his satchel was left behind, and within it, the socks. By the time he returned, the wind had shifted, snow had piled high, the satchel gone, buried. He searched for an hour, then two, but the land gave no answers. Years later, a farmer would dig that same patch of frozen earth, not looking for socks, but for roots, and he'd find them, stiff, frosted, but intact. He would take them home, boil them in vinegar, hang them to dry, and wear them for 3 more winters, never knowing who they had once warmed, only that they still did, because even snow, in all its silence, couldn't erase a good sock. Not every sock has a partner. Some are made together, worn together, washed together, and then one simply disappears. The Romans had no idea where they went. There were no laundry machines to blame, no mischievous house cats. But still, socks vanished. One such sock, small, coarse, slightly misshapen, lived out its days alone. It had once belonged to a candle maker, who wore it on his left foot every morning as he stirred wax and trimmed wicks. Its twin had gone missing one afternoon during a trip to the riverbank. Some say it fell into the water, others believed it was stolen by a gull. Whatever the truth, the left sock remained. At first, the candle maker tried to wear just the one, then sandals, then nothing. Eventually, the sock was tucked into a drawer, folded neatly beside bits of string and dried orange peels. Years passed. The candle maker grew old. His knees ached, his hands trembled, and on especially cold nights, he would slip that one sock onto his left foot, just the left, always the left. There was comfort in the imbalance, warmth in the halfness. He claimed it helped him sleep, that his dreams burned brighter when one foot remembered summer and the other still shivered with the truth of winter. After he passed, his niece cleared the home. She found the sock in the drawer, beside the orange peels, which, somehow, still held their shape. She almost threw it away, but instead, she tucked it into the sleeve of her cloak, carried it home, and placed it near the window, where the morning sun would warm it gently. It was never worn again, never needed to be. It had done its work, half of a whole, but full of story, because even a single sock can carry the weight of memory. Some socks are chosen, packed with care, wrapped in cloth, prepared for journeys. Others travel by accident. These two, grey, stiff, stitched by Publius on a lazy spring afternoon, were meant for a local farmer, a quiet man named Flavius, who always paid in carrots and smelled faintly of goats. But on the day he came to collect them, the socks were missing. Publius searched everywhere, the workbench, the storage basket, even behind the door where wind sometimes tossed scraps. Nothing. He cursed under his breath, then made a new pair, slightly smaller, which Flavius accepted with a shrug. The mystery remained, until several weeks later, a trader stopped by the shop. He was old, wore 6 rings and a hat made of pigeon feathers. He spoke quickly, asked too many questions, and left with a jar of wool balm and no socks. But as he walked away, something peeked from the top of his travel sack. 2 grey woolen rolls, tied together with thin red thread. Publius narrowed his eyes. He said nothing. The socks had hitched a ride, fallen into a sack of grain or slipped between bolts of linen, and now they were gone. Over the next months, rumours trickled in, from Cumae, then Neapolis, then across the sea in Syracuse. A sailor swore he saw a man on the docks wearing one sock higher than the other, the telltale sign of Publius's asymmetrical stitching. They had gone rogue, drifting across the empire, warming unfamiliar feet, itching unfamiliar calves. Publius imagined them folded in the bottom of a trunk, jostled by wagon wheels, or hung to dry on a boat mast as gulls circled above. They had left without permission, but somehow he didn't mind, because even socks, if stitched with enough care, sometimes long to wander. Even the steadiest hand has its off day. And on one grey, humid morning, Publius sat at his bench, thread in one hand, sock in the other, when the thread snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet ping, like a thought disappearing. He stared at it. The sock was almost done, only one stitch left. But the thread had frayed at the end, too dry perhaps, or too often tugged. He tried to rethread the needle, but his fingers were stiff that morning, his eyes blurred by the low light. 3 tries, then 5. Then he stopped, not from frustration, but from reflection. How many socks had he made by now? 100, 1,000, each one ending with a knot, a final act of quiet completion. But not this one. This sock remained almost done, almost warm, almost whole. He set it down, and for the first time in years, didn't finish it. The sock sat on the workbench all day, then into the night, then for several days more. Customers came and went, new orders arrived, but that sock remained, resting like a question no one wanted to ask. Eventually, he picked it up again, rethreaded the needle, and finished the last stitch. But something had changed. He didn't sell that sock, didn't match it with a twin. He placed it in a small box near the back of the shop, with only a single note. This one made me stop. Not all work is about finishing. Sometimes, it's about noticing when to pause, when to breathe, when to let something be incomplete. And in that tiny, uneven stitch, the one that broke the thread, Publius found a kind of peace he hadn't known he'd needed. There were, in a crate beneath the lowest shelf of Publius's shop, 2 socks that simply never fit. Not once, not on any foot. Too narrow at the ankle, too wide at the toes, as if they were stitched for a creature that had never walked the roads of Rome. He didn't remember making them. They were just there, always had been, folded politely, but stubborn in their uselessness. Occasionally, someone would try them on, a delivery boy, a visiting cousin, a customer in desperate need, but they always came off quickly. They twist when I walk. They bite at the heel. They feel like they're staring at me. Publius stopped offering them. He didn't throw them away. He rarely did. Instead, he kept them in that crate, beside warped sandals and scraps of failed thread, and still, he never quite forgot them. They had a strange persistence, like a puzzle never solved, or a tune you can't name. He examined them once, carefully, held them to the light, checked the seams, the thread, the curve of the heel, all correct, all wrong. He considered separating them, pairing each with something else, but somehow, they refused. Even in their misfit nature, they belonged together. He started calling them the philosophers, because they questioned everything. Why does a sock have to fit? Why must it be worn to be worthy? Why must every stitch lead somewhere? He never got an answer, and in time, stopped asking. But he kept the socks, wrapped them in a strip of linen, tucked them behind his tools, and on days when the wool wouldn't behave, or the world felt misaligned, he'd glance at them, still waiting, still perfectly wrong, and somehow, that made him feel a little more right. Every craft leaves behind scraps. Tiny things, easily ignored. Thread ends too short to tie. Wool clippings that fall to the floor. Unraveled stitches. Fuzzy knots. Colors that don't match. Most sock makers swept them away. Tossed them into the hearth. Forgot they ever existed. But not Publius. He kept them. In a small clay bowl near the window. A bowl so old, the glaze had faded into soft cracks. It overflowed sometimes. A quiet storm of tangled bits and forgotten fibers. One slow afternoon, the kind when the world feels half asleep, he decided to use them. Not for practice, not for fun, but for something real. A sock, from nothing but leftovers. He didn't plan it, didn't match colors, didn't measure lengths. He simply stitched, piece by piece, thread by thread. Blue wool met grey, then a stripe of something maroon, followed by a patch of yellow that had stiffened with age. The result, lumpy, lopsided, and entirely unique. Then came the second sock, no attempt to match, only to mirror the chaos. A quiet celebration of what remains. When they were done, he didn't fold them. He let them collapse in on themselves, like tired thoughts. He placed them on the bench. For 3 days, no one noticed them. No one asked. Then a girl came in, thin, muddy, eyes sharp. She didn't ask for socks. She asked for warmth. Publius handed her the pair. She stared at them, confused, then smiled. "They're strange," she said. "They're honest," he replied. She wore them out the door, one slipping a little, the other hugging tight. But she didn't stop walking, and Publius, from behind the curtain, watched the leftover socks find their purpose. Not in perfection, but in simply being enough. It began, like many endings do, with something small, a misunderstanding, a missing stitch, a sock. Gaius and Minucius had been friends since boyhood, grew up on the same street, fought the same alley brawls, shared olives, shared debts, shared everything, until the sock. Gaius had ordered a pair from Publius, standard wool, short cuff, plain grey. He had worn them once, declared them perfect. Minucius, ever the skeptic, borrowed one on a cold evening walk to the forum. Just one. He returned it the next day, but something had changed. "It's looser than before," Gaius said, holding the sock like an injured bird. "It doesn't hug the arch anymore." Minucius shrugged. "Maybe your foot got smaller." Gaius stared. Minucius smiled, but the smile didn't land. Weeks passed. They argued over dice games, over lentils, over who owed who a favor from 5 years ago. But under it all, it was the sock. That one quiet act of wear, that shift in shape, the suspicion that something once his had been stretched beyond repair. He returned to Publius, demanded a new pair, claimed the old ones had been corrupted, warped. Publius said nothing. He simply sewed. And Gaius? He wore the new socks, kept them hidden, refused to lend them, even once. He and Minucius nodded on the street, spoke politely, but the warmth was gone, and the sock, it sat in a drawer, unmatched, untouched, too stretched to wear, too full of memory to discard. Not torn, not stained, just changed. And sometimes, that's enough. Because even in Rome, among stone and law, a single stitch out of place could shift the shape of a friendship forever. Far from Rome, past vineyards, past hills, beyond the reach of marble and aqueducts, there lay a tiny village where nothing ever happened quickly. The hens clucked at dawn, the baker yawned 3 times before starting the oven, and the blacksmith worked like the sun, slow, hot, predictable. But one night, everything changed. It began with a rustling, a shifting, a soft groan, then scratching. First one, then another, then everyone. The villagers stirred in their sleep, kicked off blankets, rubbed at their calves, grumbled. Children sat up, blinking. Dogs whined. The baker's wife shouted, "For the God's sake, stop twitching." But no one could, because earlier that week, a traveling merchant had come through town, selling a bundle of Roman socks, soft he claimed, straight from the city. Half the village bought them, excited, proud. But as it turned out, they were from the bottom of Publius's scrap pile, odd sizes, stray wool, and all of them cursed with the most insistent itch. By midnight, no one was asleep. The village square filled with yawning, scratching figures, like ghosts in tunics. Someone tried boiling their socks, someone else tossed theirs in the well. Old Elia, nearly deaf, just sat there smiling, because she never bought a pair to begin with. By morning, a pile of socks burned in a quiet fire, smoke curling over sleepy rooftops, eyes red, voices hoarse, feet finally bare, and silence returned, slow, careful, like an animal, unsure if the danger had passed. From that day forward, they never trusted city wool again. They made their own, rougher, looser, but somehow less itchy. And if you walk through that village today, you'll see old sandals lined with straw, children with bare ankles in winter, and a little sign near the gate that reads, "No Roman socks beyond this point." They don't talk about the night. They don't need to. They all remember, because some itches don't fade. They just get quieter. Thread, in Rome, was not always easy to come by. Flax unraveled, wool split, silk, far too dear for a humble sockmaker like Publius. So, now and then, when the cupboard was bare, when the markets were closed, when the needle sat idle and the day too long, he used hair. Not just any hair, horsehair, collected from brushes and combs, long, coarse, and as it turns out, surprisingly strong. The sock he made that day was meant for a stable hand, a quiet boy with cracked hands and ankles that never stayed warm. Publius didn't explain the thread, didn't mention the switch, he just sewed. The horsehair fought back. It curled at the edges, snagged in the needle's eye, and whispered resistance with every pull. But he finished the sock, dark threads twined in odd spirals, the seam, rougher than usual, and the cuff, it bristled slightly. The stable boy wore it the next day, returned the day after that. "It works," he said, scratching at his shin, "but it feels like the sock is alive." Publius tilted his head. The boy shrugged. "I'll take another." And so he made one more, then another. Soon others asked too. They said the socks were different, stronger, warmer, stranger. One woman claimed she could feel the horse's spirit in them. Another swore she heard the sock whinny when she walked too quickly. Publius never confirmed the truth. He simply smiled, ran his fingers through the thread bowl, and plucked out another long strand, because when thread runs out, necessity takes over. And in Rome, where nothing is wasted and everything has a second life, even a strand of horsehair might find itself warming someone's heel. Scratchy, yes, but enduring, like all good things. In the back of Publius's shop, behind the stacks of stitched pears and the drawer of mending needles, sat a small wooden box. It was plain, unmarked, always closed. Inside it, was a single sock, folded neatly, wrapped in linen, tied with a black thread. It had been commissioned years ago, ordered by a man with grey hair, a stiff gait, and eyes that seemed always half closed. He had asked for just one, not a pair. One, said it was for his journey home. A long walk to a village near the mountains, where his brother waited with a warm hearth, and stories they'd promised to share since childhood. I just want something warm for the left foot, he had said. The right's got no feeling anyway. Publius nodded, didn't ask questions, just measured, and began sewing. The sock was made of soft wool, double-stitched at the heel, a little longer at the toe, just how the man had asked. But the man never came back. Days passed, then weeks, then a full turn of seasons. The sock remained, tucked away, unworn, untouched. Publius kept it out of respect. He told himself maybe the man had been delayed, maybe he'd sent someone else to retrieve it, maybe he'd simply forgotten. But as time passed, the story began to settle. He hadn't forgotten, he just hadn't returned. And so the sock waited, not out of utility, but out of memory. Years later, a traveler stumbled into the shop. He wore sandals that were falling apart, had a cough that rattled the windows, and no coin to offer. Publius handed him the sock, the one from the box. No words, just the gesture. The traveler didn't ask why. He simply took it, tugged it on his left foot, and sighed. And in that quiet moment, a warmth returned. Not just to the traveler, but to the thread itself, because no sock should wait forever, and every stitch, no matter how long it lies in silence, deserves to walk. They started as any other pair. Simple wool, coarse but warm, grey with a faint stripe of brown. A mistake in the dye that Publius didn't bother correcting. They were tucked into a chest, folded beside tunics and scarves, wrapped in cedar leaves, as tradition advised. And there, they waited. Seasons passed. Years turned quietly. The chest remained shut, its contents safe, or so everyone believed, until one day, the lid creaked open, and the socks were ruined. Not completely, but enough. Small holes at the heel, tiny tunnels near the toe, the unmistakable work of moths. They hadn't devoured them, only nibbled, carefully, precisely, as if testing the taste of memory. The owner, a young man named Lucanus, stared at them in disbelief. He hadn't needed them in years, had almost forgotten they were there. But now he needed warmth, and they were riddled with gaps. Still, he put them on. The air slipped through the holes, tickled the skin, made his feet feel both clothed and bare at once. He walked in them anyway, through the orchard, to the well, across the quiet floorboards of a house that creaked more than it used to. There was something comforting in their damage, in the way they hung on, despite the quiet feasting of time. Eventually, he brought them to Publius, held them out like broken tools. Publius said nothing, only turned them over in his hands, and nodded. He didn't patch them, didn't replace them. He simply reinforced the edges, stitched a soft border of thread around the wounds. He handed them back. They're not new, he said. They're yours. Lucanus wore them the rest of the winter, and when spring came, he placed them back in the chest, moth holes and all. But this time, he lined the lid with rosemary and cloves, because even old socks deserve a fighting chance. The cemetery lay just outside the city walls, where the road bent slightly, and wild flowers grew between cracked stones. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet that feels older than words. Among the scattered headstones and clay urns, there was one grave, unmarked, modest, but carefully tended. A small pile of pebbles rested near its edge, a sprig of lavender, and something unexpected, a sock, just one, folded gently, the wool faded by time, edges fraying like whispered goodbyes. No note, no name, but someone had placed it there, not carelessly, not as trash, but as offering, a tribute. Publius had heard rumors, a boy who died too young, loved running barefoot through the forum, always kicked off his sandals. His mother, they said, used to chase him through the alleys, with a pair of socks in her hand, begging him to cover his feet. He never did. The day he fell ill, she wrapped his feet in wool herself, held them as the fever climbed, held them as it passed, and after, she kept one, just one, folded it, carried it, and one spring morning, when the ground was soft enough, she left it by the stone, not to keep him warm, not anymore, but to say, "You were mine, you are remembered." Visitors walked by, some confused, some moved, few understood, but Publius did, because socks are not just garments, they're closeness, they're care, they're the last thing you remove at the end of a day, and sometimes, The last thing you hold on to when a life is gone. The sock remained for weeks, then faded with the wind, but the space it left still felt full. He came into Publius's shop with the sun in his eyes and mud on his boots. His armor was scratched, his hair too short for fashion, his gaze distant. A soldier, clearly, but not a young one. Not anymore. "I need socks," he said. "Warm ones, quiet ones." Publius nodded, pulled down a folded pair from the shelf. "These are sturdy," he said. "Reinforced heel. Won't slide in boots." The soldier smiled faintly. "This my third time buying from you," he said. "Maybe fourth." Publius paused. "I don't remember." The soldier shrugged. "I don't either." He paid in coin that smelled of horses, tucked the socks into his satchel, and left. 3 weeks later, he returned. Same boots, same mud, same smile. "I need socks," he said. Publius raised an eyebrow. "The last pair." The soldier frowned. "Gone. Lost. Maybe. Or I gave them away. I forget." And so it went. Over the course of a year, the soldier returned 6 times. Never angry, never ashamed. He simply forgot. Socks were left in barracks, under tavern tables, at the feet of strangers he barely remembered meeting. He treated them like letters without addresses, sent out into the world, hoping they'd land somewhere warm. Publius never scolded, never raised the price, just kept making more. One day, the soldier didn't come. Winter passed, spring settled in, and then, a letter, carried by a boy with dust on his cheeks. It was short. "Thank you for the warmth. I remembered you, even when I forgot everything else." Inside the folded parchment, a sock, only one, frayed, familiar. Publius held it a long time, didn't display it, didn't sell it, just placed it gently on the shelf, beside his spools of thread. Because some men forget where they've been, forget what they carried, but socks remember. It was the most unusual thing. A customer returned to Publius's shop, eyes wide with disbelief, clutching a pair of grey socks like sacred relics. "They didn't itch," she whispered. Publius blinked. "Not even a little." "Nothing," she said. "I wore them all day, worked in the garden, ran to the forum, danced at my cousin's wedding. Not a single scratch." He leaned over the counter, took the socks in his hands, turned them over, checked the seams, the wool, the stretch of the cuff. They were his, no doubt, made from the usual materials. No special thread, no forgotten oils. They were, by all accounts, ordinary, but they didn't itch. He thought perhaps the woman had tougher skin, or maybe she had become numb to discomfort. Yet when others tried them, neighbors, strangers, even his own nephew, they all reported the same strange miracle. Soft, smooth, like silk made from patience. Word spread. People traveled from the next village, then the next province, all asking for the ones that don't itch. Publius tried to recreate them. Same technique, same wool, same hour of day, but every new pair itched. Some more, some less, but none like those. He began to suspect they had stitched themselves, or perhaps been blessed by a sleepy household spirit who'd grown tired of scratching. He stopped selling the original pair. He kept them near the window, watched how they caught the morning light, how they folded without effort. One day a child came in, barefoot, curious. She reached for them. Publius hesitated, then handed them over. She slipped them on, smiled, and said only one thing: "They feel like a hug." She left the shop, and the socks were never seen again. But people still came, still asked, and every now and then, Publius would pause at the window and wonder, was it really the wool, or simply a moment when the world was too gentle to itch? They were made on a whim. A quiet afternoon, the streets outside hushed by soft rain, and Publius's hands restless. He pulled out the good wool, the kind he rarely touched. Silky threads, pale cream and copper red, dyed from herbs too costly to waste on everyday soles. He didn't follow a pattern. Let the colors wander. Let the curves of each stitch shape themselves. No urgency, no customer in mind. He was making because he could, because the act itself soothed something in him. When he finished, he didn't fold them. He laid them flat, side by side, and stared. The socks shimmered, faintly, like firelight on still water. No itch, no unevenness, no loose threads. They were perfect, too perfect. For 3 days he left them on the bench. Each customer admired them, asked about them, offered coins, even gold. But Publius said no. He couldn't explain why. It wasn't fear of ruin or pride. It was something quieter. Wearing them, he thought, would reduce them to function. And these socks, These particular socks had become something else. Not clothing, not product, but a reminder that beauty can bloom in silence, that care, when unhurried, can make something that feels complete. He placed them in a small box, lined with olive leaves, sealed it with wax, and tucked it beneath his workbench. He never wore them, never gave them away, never made another pair like them. They remained there until the end of his days, unworn, unspoiled, the perfect socks, not made for feet, but for proof that even in a world of sandals and sandals alone, one can create something simply because it wanted to exist. She was older than most who came to Publius's shop, hair like faded parchment, eyes ringed with quiet. She didn't say much, didn't browse, just stood there, looking at the wall where the plainest socks were hung. Finally, she pointed. That one. Publius nodded, pulled the pair down. Standard wool, no dye, no fancy seam. Gift, he asked. She shook her head. No. Memory. She paid in coin worn thin at the edges. Didn't ask for wrapping. Took the socks in her hands as if they were scrolls from long ago. But as she turned to leave, she paused. Would you mind if I sat a moment? He gestured toward the bench by the window. She sat slowly, unfolded one sock, ran her fingers across the fabric, and then she wept, quietly, steadily. No heaving sobs, just tears that knew exactly where to fall. Publius didn't interrupt, didn't ask why, but after some time she spoke. My son wore socks like these, before the war, before the letter came. She held the sock to her cheek, as if trying to remember the warmth, not of the wool, but of footsteps, of noise in the hall, of laughter down the stairs. He hated them, she said, almost smiling. Always said they were scratchy, but he wore them anyway, because I made them. She folded the sock again, held it in her lap like a folded prayer. They're not the same, she whispered, but close enough. And with that she rose, left without another word. Publius stood still for a long time after. Not sad, not confused, just humbled, because he had always believed socks were tools, for warmth, for walking. But sometimes, a sock could be a key to grief, to love, to what was lost. And on certain days, the softest fabric in the world was a memory that held your hand. The skies over Rome had darkened early that day. Clouds rolled in thick and heavy, like wool pulled too tight across the heavens. By dusk the wind howled, shutters slammed, candles flickered, and rain fell in sheets, drumming on clay roofs like war drums softened by time. Most shops closed early, doors latched, chimneys stoked, but not Publius. His little workshop, lit by one stubborn oil lamp, stood warm against the storm. He didn't fear thunder, he didn't rush. In fact, he sewed more carefully during storms, said the rhythm of rain helped guide the stitch, said the world outside had to roar, so the small quiet work inside could feel brave. That night he reached for the darkest wool he had, a deep storm-grey strand, with just a thread of gold woven through it. The sock came slowly. His hands paused often, listening to the wind scrape across the shutters. Each flash of lightning cast strange shadows on the wall, but he didn't flinch. He kept sewing, and when the final knot was tied, he looked down and saw not just a sock, but a small, soft rebellion, a promise that even in chaos, something gentle could still take shape. In the morning, the sun returned, streets glistened, birds shook water from their feathers, and neighbors opened doors with tired, grateful faces. Publius placed the sock on the sill, let it dry in the light, and smiled. It wasn't perfect. The toe had a wobble, the heel a soft bulge, but it had been made in the storm, not despite it, but with it. And sometimes, the socks sewn in the hardest moments hold the most warmth, not because of the wool, but because of the weather they survived. It wasn't planned. Most clever things aren't. Publius had been working late, a commission for a merchant's son who wanted socks that looked important. Important? What a strange request. So Publius added a cuff of dyed wool, trimmed the edges neatly, even stitched the initials CM on the sole, just for flair. But as he worked the inside of the left sock, his needle slipped, twice. It snagged at a fold, then curled back on itself, creating a soft pocket, tucked just above the arch. He almost undid it, almost ripped it out, but instead, he paused, pressed his finger into the fold, and smiled. A pocket, barely big enough for a coin, or a key, or a single folded note. He didn't tell the merchant's son, didn't charge extra, just folded the socks with care and sent them off. Weeks passed, then months, until one day, a different man walked in, well-dressed, polished, but anxious. "Are you the one who made these?" He held up the sock, worn now, but intact, and still pocketed. Publius nodded slowly. The man reached into the fold, pulled out a tiny piece of parchment. "I didn't know it was there," he said, "until I wore them on the road to Ostia. The sock pressed against my foot strangely. I reached inside and found this." He unfolded the note. It was short, a name, a date, and a single word. "Remember." He didn't say more, didn't need to. He left with the socks, and Publius never asked. But that night, he made another, not for sale, not for style, just with a small pocket, hidden, waiting. Because sometimes, the smallest spaces hold the most meaning, and sometimes, the warmest place for a secret is beneath your heel, where the world forgets to look. At first, Publius thought it was the floorboards. The old ones in his workshop had always groaned, especially on humid days. But the sound followed him, from the bench to the shelf to the hearth, a soft, unmistakable squeak, like a mouse or a poorly oiled cartwheel coming from his socks. He sat down, lifted his foot, flexed it, squeak. He frowned. The socks were newly made. Wool, yes, but spun tighter than usual. He'd used a strange batch of thread that had arrived in a crate marked only. Experimental. The squeak returned with every step, high-pitched, innocent, irritating. He changed sandals, sanded the soles, tried walking on straw, on stone, on clay. Still, squeak, squeak. And yet, as the days passed, he began to laugh. Customers turned when he walked. Children giggled and followed the noise, calling him Mr. Mousefoot. He embraced it, began offering them as a novelty. "Socks that talk when you walk," he'd say, with a grin. They sold quickly, not because they were warm, though they were, not because they were durable, though they squeaked long after the color faded, but because people liked the surprise, the reminder that even something as humble as a sock could carry a voice. One man wore them to a dull Senate meeting, claimed every squeak helped him stay awake. Another gave a pair to his aging father, so he could hear when he walked through the garden. Even Publius, when alone at night, would sometimes slip them on and walk quietly through his shop, letting the faint squeaks fill the stillness like a lullaby. Eventually the thread ran out. The box marked experimental was never sent again, but now and then a squeak would echo in a passing crowd, someone somewhere still wearing them, and Publius would smile, knowing that even silence can be softened by the smallest sound beneath your feet. It sat at the edge of the shelf, wrapped in waxed cloth, tied with a string so thin it frayed when touched. One sock, only one, no match, no partner. Publius had made it in silence, no order, no purpose. A simple shape, even stitching. Wool the color of ash, not dark, not light, but the in-between shade of memory. When he finished it, he didn't reach for a second, didn't cast on new thread, didn't even trim the end. He just paused. For days it remained untouched. Dust gathered slowly around it, like a circle drawn by time. Occasionally a customer would notice, ask where's the other. He would shake his head gently. It doesn't have one. No explanation, no story. It simply was. One day, a woman came in, carrying a heavy bag and heavier silence. She noticed the sock immediately. "May I?" Publius nodded. She unwrapped it slowly, ran her thumb along the seam, held it against her chest, then said, "My husband died with one foot bare." The soldiers didn't think it mattered. She didn't cry, didn't explain further. But when she looked up, Publius already understood. He handed her the sock. No coin was asked, no thanks expected, and she left, clutching something that had waited, quietly, to be needed. After that, Publius never made its match. He never made another one like it. Because some socks aren't meant to be worn, some aren't meant to be part of a pair. Some are just waiting, for the moment, when they become exactly what someone needs. It began with a missing sock, not unusual. Socks went missing all the time, dropped in the market, blown off a line, forgotten in sandals left by the fire. But this one vanished inside the shop. Publius was certain. He had finished the pair just the night before. Soft brown wool, stitched tight for a cobbler's apprentice. He had set them on the windowsill to cool, as the evening breeze danced through the shutters. By morning, only one remained. He searched, under tables, behind crates, even inside his thread bowl. Nothing. Then days later, a sound, a rustle, like parchment, a thump, then a scramble. And there, near the back corner of the shop, in a nest of unraveled yarn and lint, lay a cat. Not his, no collar, no name, just wide, guilty eyes, and tucked beneath its chin, the missing sock. It had curled into it, clawed at it, pawed it into submission, and fallen asleep. Publius stepped forward, then stopped. The sock was frayed now, tugged thin in places, covered in fur, but the cat looked so content, he let it be. From that day on, the cat came and went as it pleased, always sleeping in socks too misshapen to sell, always dragging them to its little corner, where light slanted through the rafters, and dust danced like lazy ghosts. Customers learned to leave out scraps, children whispered stories of a sock guardian, and Publius? He began leaving imperfect socks, exactly where he hoped the cat would find them, because even failed stitches deserve soft endings, and even a stolen sock, if it brings warmth to something small and forgotten, is not truly lost. The masons swore it was a mistake. He'd been patching the rear wall of a baker's home, a quiet corner near the bread oven, where heat always lingered, and stones dried faster than expected. He chipped away the old plaster, expecting dust, maybe a rat's nest, but instead, socks, 2 of them, pressed flat between layers of stone, dry, dark, forgotten. He pulled them free slowly, as if disturbing something sacred. The wool was faded, but intact, and tucked inside the heel of one, a small scrap of parchment. 4 words: keep what you love. No name, no date, just the socks, and silence. Words spread quickly, as things often do when they don't make sense. Some said they were part of a blessing, protection for the home. Others thought it was a secret pact between lovers who had no place to meet, except between stones. The baker, an older woman with kind hands, simply nodded. My husband rebuilt that wall 30 years ago, she said. He always said it was warmer after. She folded the socks and placed them near her hearth. Didn't wear them, didn't wash them, just let them sit. 2 quiet guardians of bread, warmth, and the spaces between. Publius heard the story days later, didn't remember making those socks, but the stitching looked like his. It made him think. How many socks had he sewn? How many now lived under beds, in drawers, on shelves, or behind walls, with secrets folded inside? He smiled softly, because sometimes a sock is not for the foot, it's for the moment, the memory, the message you leave behind, when words are no longer safe. The fire came without warning, a crackle, a shout, then flames curling up from the bakery next door. Sparks jumped like insects in the night. Wood snapped, windows sighed and gave way. Publius had only minutes. He grabbed what he could, his thread basket, his shears, a bundle of orders wrapped in twine, but the shop was lost. By morning, the air reeked of ash, charcoal traced the edges of every stone, and all that remained was a blackened frame, where warmth once lived. Neighbors helped, offered bread, offered coin, but there was nothing to repair, only to rebuild. Later that week, as Publius sifted through the ruins, he found it, beneath a scorched beam, curled in a nest of ash and shattered tile. A sock, just one, soot-covered, edges singed, but whole. He held it carefully, still warm from the sun. The color was nearly gone, but the stitches held. It had survived, not untouched, but undefeated. He didn't clean it, didn't try to restore its shape. He placed it on a new shelf in the corner of his new shop. Once it was built brick by brick, with neighbors and memory, there it stayed, never for sale, never moved. Customers would glance at it, some would ask. He'd nod toward it and say, "That one walked through fire." It became a kind of quiet mascot, proof that softness can endure heat, that something humble can become a symbol of survival. Not perfect, not pristine, but still standing. Because sometimes, what matters most is not how bright you were before the flames, but how whole you remained after. It was found in a ditch, not tossed, not buried, just resting. No tag, no initials stitched in, no sign of wear. A sock in perfect condition, but with no owner, no story, no reason to exist where it did. A shepherd's boy discovered it while chasing a lamb along the roadside. He brought it to town, holding it like a strange treasure. Most thought it had fallen from a passing cart. Others guessed it was dropped during a festival, lost in laughter, in dancing feet. It made its way to Publius, as all stray socks eventually did. He examined it carefully, soft, well-crafted, seamless, but not his work. He knew every stitch he'd ever sewn, every bend of his needle. This sock had a different rhythm, as if made by someone with steadier hands, or a different kind of care. Still, it was too fine to discard. So he placed it on a peg in the shop, beneath a small sign. Yours. No one ever claimed it. Weeks passed. Then months. People began to whisper that it was a lucky sock, that whoever it belonged to must have had a life so charmed. Even their lost things were beautiful. A girl once asked if she could have it. Publius said no. It isn't lost, he said, just waiting. But waiting for what? No one could say. Eventually, he wrapped it in linen and set it in the window, where morning light would catch its shape and strangers could pause and wonder. It was a reminder. Not everything has to be used, or understood, or even claimed. Some things simply appear, briefly, quietly, and remind us that the world still holds mysteries, with no need for answers. They were barely the size of a fist, no more than a handful of wool, delicately shaped, soft as breath, too small for any man, too small for any child. These socks were made for a baby, one not yet born. Publius hadn't made them to sell. He'd made them in silence, one quiet evening when the world outside was grey, and no orders pressed at his hands. The wool had come from a shepherd woman who'd traded it for sandals. It was white, with tiny flecks of straw still caught in it, and it smelled faintly of the fields. He shaped the socks slowly, not with precision, but with tenderness. No one watched, no one asked. He didn't speak of them to anyone. He placed them in a tiny box, lined it with linen, and tied it shut. For a long time they stayed there, hidden, waiting, not forgotten, just preserved. Until one day, a young couple entered the shop. They looked tired, worried, hopeful. "We've just come from the midwife," the woman said. Her hands rested over her belly. "We were told to keep warm things close." Publius listened, nodded, and without a word, he reached under the counter, opened the small box, and held it out to her. Her eyes widened. She touched the socks with fingertips trembling, not from fear, but from something gentler. "Did someone order these?" she whispered. "No," Publius said. "They were waiting," she cried, quietly. The kind of cry that folds joy and worry into one. They took the socks, left more coin than necessary, and weeks later, a soft knock at the door. A man stood there, smiling. In his arms, wrapped in wool, a newborn sleeping soundly. On the baby's feet, 2 tiny socks, still warm, still whole. Because even in Rome, where roads are hard and sandals rule the day, there are small quiet feet that deserve soft beginnings. It wasn't meant to be a hat. It had been crafted like any other. Thick wool, modest in length, with a slight taper at the toe. But fate, like thread, tangles when we least expect it. It began with a traveler, a young man from the southern coast, unfamiliar with Rome's sudden winter rains. His cloak was thin, his sandals soaked, and his head entirely bare. He wandered into Publius's shop, dripping and shivering. "I need warmth," he muttered. "Anywhere I can find it." Publius reached behind him, handed over a dry pair of socks. The man looked at them, looked at his feet. Then, without hesitation, he pulled one over his head. It clung tightly, stretching just enough to cover his crown. The toe flopped slightly to one side, giving him the look of a sleepy jester. But he grinned. "It works." Publius chuckled. "Unorthodox." "Warm," the traveler replied, tugging the second sock into his pack. "I'll save this one for my actual feet." And just like that, a trend began. Days later, a boy wandered in, wearing a sock on each hand, then a woman with one around her teapot, then an old man who swore he tied his lunch up in them, because cloth doesn't stretch like good wool. Publius didn't protest. He stopped labeling them left or right, stopped assuming socks had one destiny. He began sewing them with longer cuffs, softer interiors, even asked a seamstress once how she shaped a bonnet. Because if people wanted to wear socks on their heads, or their hands, or their hearts, who was he to argue? Warmth, after all, doesn't care what shape it takes. And sometimes, the thing we thought was meant for one purpose becomes perfect for another. A sock is still a sock, even when worn like a crown. It was one of those breezy Roman afternoons, when parchment flutters, aprons snap like sails, and the market square fills with dust and noise. Publius had hung a row of freshly finished socks on a line just outside the shop, each one clipped with care, their toes swaying gently in the wind. One was white, soft-spun wool, thin, light as breath, and it danced more than the rest, fluttered and dipped like wings. A boy selling figs pointed and laughed. "Look, a pigeon." Publius turned just in time to see a curious old man squint up at the sock, raise a crust of bread, and toss crumbs beneath it. A crowd gathered. Some insisted it was a bird. Others said it was a spirit. One woman gasped, claiming she'd seen it blink. By the time Publius walked out, the sock had twisted itself tightly on the line. Its opening puffed like a breast, its toe bobbing like a beak. He didn't correct them. Instead, he watched how the children crept closer, whispering gentle greetings. How even the loudest vendors grew quiet, letting the breeze carry its strange illusion. For the rest of the day, no one dared touch it. They fed it scraps, sang to it, left petals beneath its perch. That evening, as the sun dipped low, a real pigeon finally landed beside it, looked it over once, and flew away, unimpressed. Publius smiled, took down the sock. He didn't wash it, didn't sell it. He placed it in a small basket marked, almost alive, because sometimes, in the right light, even a simple sock can become something else. A bird, a story, a moment of shared wonder on an ordinary street. And truly, what more could wool hope to be? Borders in ancient Rome weren't always marked with stones. Sometimes they were rivers, sometimes they were soldiers, and sometimes they were silence. He came at dusk, dust-covered cloak, eyes that moved before his feet. He spoke little, only asked, "Do you have socks that won't be searched?" Publius looked up, measuring the man. "Wool doesn't hide much," he said. But the man leaned closer. "I need to carry something small, something important, and it must cross unseen." There was no anger in his voice, just urgency and weariness. Publius nodded slowly, reached behind the bench, drew out a pair of thick winter socks, but not ordinary ones. Between the inner lining and the outer weave, he had once stitched a narrow tunnel of space, a trick he'd used long ago to hide a friend's wedding ring during a tax inspection. He'd never made them for sale, but they were there, waiting. He handed them over. The man paid in silence, tucked something into the sock's hollow, so carefully, so reverently. It might have been a scroll, a ring, a final letter. He left without another word. Months passed, no word, no return, until one morning, a small parcel arrived. No name. Inside, a stone, smooth, warm in color, and a single sock. Empty now, but perfectly preserved. No message, only the quiet weight of gratitude, folded into the wool. Publius never learned what had been carried, nor where it went, but he placed the sock on his shelf, beside the others that had stories, too quiet to tell. Because sometimes, socks don't just warm feet, they carry hope, carry danger, carry the last thread of what someone loved across the lines drawn by men, and what they protect isn't always seen, but always felt. The prison was a cold stone building, tucked behind the grain warehouses, where sun rarely reached, and silence weighed more than chains. It wasn't the kind of place you visited, and if you did, you didn't ask questions. But one day, a woman came to Publius's shop, holding a basket of laundry. "My brother," she said softly, "hasn't seen warmth in weeks." She placed a coin on the counter, then added another and another. More than a pair of socks should cost, more than she likely had. Publius didn't ask. He reached for his finest wool, the kind that hugged the skin instead of scratching it. Dark brown to hide stains, double-stitched at the toes. As he worked, the woman stood quietly, watching, hands clutched at her sleeves like someone trying not to shiver. When he finished, she stepped closer. "I need to give him a message," she said, but the guards read everything. Publius understood. He turned the socks inside out, split the seam near the ankle with a thin silver needle, slipped a sliver of parchment into the hollow space. Then he closed it, stitched it shut with thread the same color as the rest, invisible. He handed them over, folded neatly in cloth. No nod, no promise, just understanding. Weeks passed, then one morning, before the shop had opened, a small package appeared at the door. Inside, a pair of worn socks, and a note. "They kept me warm, but her words kept me alive." No name, no return address, just the smell of stone dust, and something like hope, still clinging to the wool. Publius didn't speak of it, but he made another pair that day, and left a seam slightly loose just in case, because sometimes, even behind walls, even in chains, what matters most can still find its way, stitched quietly beneath the ankle of a humble Roman sock. It was black, not the deep black of ink, but the soft, dusty shade of ashes left too long in the hearth. Publius had made it weeks before, not for sale, not for warmth, but because something in him had grown still. He didn't tell anyone, didn't write a name on the ledger. He just sewed in silence. The funeral was quiet. held just outside the city, near the olive groves, where wind whispered between the trees and the sun filtered through the branches like slow-moving time. The man who wore the socks, an uncle perhaps, or a friend, stepped carefully through the dry grass, each footfall soft and soundless. The rest of him wore the usual garments, a tunic cinched too tightly, a cloak borrowed for the occasion. But the socks, they were his. No one saw them. They were hidden inside his sandals, pressed gently against his feet as he stood near the grave. As ashes were lowered, as prayers were spoken, as silence held the edges of every word. Later, he returned to the shop, not to buy, not to talk. He placed the socks, folded neatly on the counter. They did their job, he said. Publius nodded. Would you like them cleaned? The man shook his head. No, let them rest, and he left. Publius never asked who had passed, never learned whose memory had been carried in the softness of those stitches, but he didn't need to, because some socks aren't meant to last. They're meant to witness, to walk one final path with someone who remembers, and afterward, they too are laid down, folded gently, and allowed to sleep. He arrived near closing time, breathless, red in the face, carrying nothing but regret. I need a pair, he said, his voice tight with something unsaid, quickly. Something soft, something honest. Publius paused. Honest. The man nodded. I've said the wrong thing, too many wrong things, and I don't know how to take them back. He looked down at his hands, rough, calloused. I thought of flowers, but they wilt, letters burn, jewelry says too much, and socks. Publius asked gently. The man hesitated. They say, I want you to be warm, even if you don't forgive me. Publius understood. He reached for a skein of pale grey wool, not flashy, not loud, but soft, consistent, the colour of rain-washed stones. He worked through the night, no flourishes, no extra patterns, just careful stitches, each one a small act of apology. When the man returned the next morning, he held the socks to his chest, like they carried something sacred. Will it be enough? He asked. Publius didn't answer. Some things aren't for shopkeepers to decide. Weeks later, a note arrived. No signature, no return address, just 4 words. She wore them twice. That was all. But it was enough. Because sometimes, a sock isn't just a gift. It's an offering, a truce, a way to say, I may not deserve your kindness, but your feet still deserve to be warm. It was wedged between 2 dusty pages, tucked inside a forgotten scroll on Roman law. A sock, thin, creased, folded with precision. The librarian had nearly missed it. She turned the parchment, expecting marginalia, perhaps a pressed leaf. Instead, wool, faded blue, frayed at the toe, but neatly folded like a letter. At first she thought it was a mistake, some careless student's lost garment. But as she held it, she noticed something curious. It smelled faintly of lavender. Not must, not time, but care. She brought it to Publius. He turned it in his hands, studied the seam. Mine, he said softly. From years ago, I remember this thread. He didn't recall who bought it, didn't know how it ended up in a law book, on a forgotten shelf, in the rear corner of the Athenaeum. But it must have been placed there on purpose. And sure enough, hidden beneath the folded cuff, a scrap of paper. In faded ink, it read, When the rules grow cruel, warmth is its own rebellion. Publius held the sock for a moment longer, then handed it back to the librarian. You should keep it, he said, for when your hands grow cold between pages. She did, and sometimes, on quiet afternoons, she would wear it on one hand as she shelved scrolls, letting the wool glide over the spines of forgotten knowledge, like a quiet companion. Because even among books, even in halls of reason, there is room for something soft, something kind, something that once wrapped a foot and now wraps a memory. It was left at dawn, placed with great care on the lowest step of the Temple of Vesta. No note, no offering bowl, just a single folded sock, wrapped in linen, tied with twine, and dusted with rose petals. The temple maidens found it first. At first they thought it an accident, a beggar's discarded scrap, but it was too deliberate, too clean, and the petals, those were no mistake. They brought it inside, laid it near the sacred flame, and waited. No one came. By sundown, the petals had wilted, but the sock remained, still warm from the stone, as if it had held someone's hope long into the night. One of the priestesses, young, quiet, often overlooked, picked it up. She pressed it to her cheek and whispered, I think someone asked for kindness. Publius heard the story later. The temple guard told it over olives and wine. He said it with a chuckle. But Publius didn't laugh. He knew the kind of person who would leave a sock at the feet of a goddess. Someone humble, someone desperate, someone who believed warmth itself might be worthy of divine notice. The priestesses never returned the sock. They kept it in a cedar box, near the lamp oil, wrapped again in cloth, and sometimes, on stormy days, they'd press it gently into someone's hand, a grieving widow, a trembling child, a woman alone in the world, and they'd say, "It was already waiting for you." Because not every prayer is loud, not every offering burns. Some are stitched in wool, laid down at dawn, and left to become whatever comfort the world allows. It was packed in a small sailor's bag, tucked between coils of rope, a carved wooden charm, and 3 pieces of salted fish. The sailor was young, barely old enough to grow a beard, but his mother had insisted. "You'll freeze," she said, tucking the sock into his hands. "Ships don't care if your toes turn blue." He'd only laughed. "Ma, no one wears socks on a tri-rim. They'll tease me." She ignored him, pressed the folded wool against his chest. "It's not for wearing, it's for remembering." He nodded, didn't understand, but took it anyway. Out at sea, as gulls vanished and stars took their place above the mast, he found himself reaching for it, not to wear, but to hold. It smelled of her hearth, of home, of a place where things were slow and soft, and no one shouted across the wind. During storms, he tucked it under his tunic. During calm, he rested it against his cheek like a stone worn smooth by riverbeds. It wasn't armor, it wasn't rations, but it protected him all the same. When the ship returned months later, he stepped onto land barefoot, soles cracked, laughter loud, but the sock, still in his pocket, still whole. He walked straight to Publius's shop, laid the salt-flecked wool on the counter. "My mother died while I was away," he said quietly. "She made this before she fell ill. Did you teach her the stitch?" Publius nodded once. "I teach many." The sailor smiled. "Then you've given me something too." He didn't buy anything, didn't stay, just left the sock behind, as if it had completed its voyage, and Publius kept it. Salt-stained, sun-worn, smelling faintly of sea and memory. Because some socks aren't meant to be worn. They're meant to travel, to carry something unseen, across waters too wide for goodbye. It hung by the hearth for days. Close enough to feel the warmth, but never close enough to change. Other socks dried within hours, their damp wool relaxing, curling slightly at the cuff, ready to be folded away. But this one, it stayed heavy, cold at the heel, its toe always damp, as if clinging to the memory of water. Publius had tried everything, pressed it gently with a cloth, hung it higher, nearer the chimney, left it out in the sun. Still, it remained wet, not soaked, not dripping, just not dry. He began to wonder, had it been cursed? Had someone worn it during a crossing of the Tiber and whispered secrets into its seam? One old customer swore she'd seen this before. "Some cloth remembers sorrow," she said. "Won't let it go, won't wring it out." Publius didn't argue. Instead, he placed it in a bowl, ceramic, cracked at the rim, and added lavender sprigs. Not to dry it, but to keep it company. People began to notice. They'd lean over the counter, gaze down at the sock sitting in its shallow dish, still damp, still waiting, and they'd whisper things. Regrets, goodbyes, names they hadn't spoken aloud in years, as if the sock would hold them, soak them in, keep them close, and strangely, it did. Over time, it became a ritual. Rainy days, quiet evenings, a cup of tea beside a sock that wouldn't dry. Not a nuisance, but a companion, because not everything is meant to heal quickly. Not everything dries when we ask it to. Some things, some people, hold water longer than others, and maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe that's a form of remembering. They brought his body back at dusk, wrapped in linen, his sandals laid beside him, worn smooth from miles no one had counted. No trumpet, no banner, just silence and dirt. His mother came to Publius the next morning. She didn't cry, not then. She carried only a satchel, and inside his last letter. Short, grateful, tired. At the bottom, a note. Tell Publius the socks held, even through snow. She unfolded them on the counter, torn near the heel, threadbare, stained with the dark map of a journey that ended too soon. He wore them until the end, she said. Publius didn't speak. He ran his fingers over the seam. A familiar line, one he'd sewn with care, not knowing where those steps would lead. "Would you make another pair?" she asked. "For the burial?" He nodded, but not from fresh wool, not from the bright skeins stacked neatly on the shelf. Instead, he unraveled a length from his own scarf, a grey thread that had kept him warm for many winters. He wove them slowly, with no hurry, no pattern, just steady hands and quiet breath. By dusk, they were ready, no embellishment, no hidden pocket, just warmth, enough for one final journey into the soil. The funeral was small, and as the earth was pressed over the linen, the socks went with him, not on his feet, but wrapped in his hands, as if to carry warmth into whatever waited beyond. Publius watched from a distance, didn't approach, didn't offer comfort, only bowed his head to the memory of someone who walked far and was finally home. Because some socks don't stay in drawers, they don't wait by the hearth, they walk until the walking ends, and then they rest, just like the ones they served. He came in just before the rains, hood drawn low, boots caked in dust, hands twitching at his sides like someone used to grabbing things quickly and letting go even quicker. He didn't browse, didn't ask. He pointed. Those. Wool. Dark. Fast. Publius raised an eyebrow. Fast. For running. There was a pause. Then, without a word, Publius reached for a pair of charcoal grey socks, tightly spun, worn well against stone. The man threw down a coin, more than enough, but didn't wait for change. He left with the socks in hand, already pulling them on, as he disappeared into the alley. Later that week, rumours circled. A thief had vanished mid-chase. Guards swore they saw him leap a market wall, disappear over a garden roof, silent as fog, fast as a ghost. All he left behind, a sandal caught on a nail, and beneath it, a single wool sock, torn at the toe, still warm. Publius found it the next morning, placed just outside his shop door. No note, no coin, just the sock. He picked it up slowly, turned it in his hand. There, stitched into the hem with red thread. "Thank you." He smiled, didn't ask questions, didn't tell anyone. He placed the sock in the corner, between the fire-warped pair and the one that had sailed the sea. Because sometimes, even a thief needs warmth. Even someone running from the law, maybe running towards something softer. And maybe, just maybe, a sock helped them get there. It sat on the workbench, needles still inside, thread looped mid-stitch like a thought interrupted. No one remembered when he started it, not even Publius. He'd meant to finish it. Of course he had. It was the beginning of winter. Orders were piling in. Wool was running low. But for some reason this pair wasn't urgent. He'd spun the cuff, formed the ankle, even shaped half the heel. Then, something else came up. A visitor, a letter, a funeral. He couldn't remember. The sock remained. Days passed, then weeks. Eventually, it was moved, from the bench to a shelf, then to a small clay bowl, where it curled like a sleeping creature that never fully woke. Customers would sometimes ask, "Is this for sale?" Publius would smile, "No, it's not ready." But privately, he knew it never would be, and that became part of its charm. Children would lean over the counter to stare at it. Old men would nod to it as if greeting an old friend. Once, a poet stared at it for nearly an hour, before whispering, "Some things are more beautiful in pause." It became a symbol in the shop, not of failure, but of rest, of stillness, of the quiet truth that not all things need to be complete to have meaning. Sometimes, half a sock is enough to remember what it was becoming, enough to show the shape of care, enough to prove that even unfinished softness can warm something inside us. Publius never unraveled it, never tried to finish it, because in that quiet pause, the sock had already become exactly what it needed to be. The storm came without warning. Thunder rolled over the hills, and rain struck the stone streets of Rome, like drummers marching in. Shops shuttered, carts overturned, and those without shelter scattered for cover. Under a stone archway, two strangers met. One was a traveller, wet cloak, tired eyes, blisters on both feet. The other, a baker's assistant, still carrying flour on her sleeves, and a bundle under her arm. They nodded politely, then settled into silence, but the traveller was shivering, socks soaked, bare toes pressed against cold stone. The girl noticed. She looked down at her bundle, pulled it open. Inside, one pair of wool socks, new, warm, fresh from the market. She didn't speak, just tore the pair in two, handed him one sock, kept the other for herself. They each wore one, on their colder foot. He laughed softly. She did too. It didn't make sense, but it made kindness. They sat that way until the rain passed. 2 feet warm, 2 feet cold, but hearts leaning toward warmth. When the sky cleared, they stood, exchanged no names, only glances. He left his sock behind. She tucked it into her apron. Later that week, she brought it to Publius, told him the story with a smile that lasted longer than it should have. He placed it beside the sock that never dried, didn't wash it, didn't need to, because some socks are not about feet. They're about the act of sharing, when neither of you has enough, but you give anyway. Half a sock, full of warmth. The boy limped into the shop near sunset, dust clinging to his knees, blood blooming quietly through his sandal strap. He didn't cry, didn't speak, just looked around like someone searching for permission to hurt. Publius noticed the gash, a clean cut across the top of the foot, sharp but shallow. "Sit," he said, without fuss. The boy obeyed. No parent in sight, no explanation, just skin that needed covering. Publius reached under the counter. No linens, no salves, but there, folded, soft, a sock, wool, old, washed dozens of times, and softer for it. He tore it gently, down the cuff, then again across the foot, wrapped it like a ribbon around the boy's wound, knotted it once, twice. It held. The boy finally whispered, "Will it stop bleeding?" Publius nodded. In a moment, they sat there quietly. The shop smelled of warm wood and wool. Outside, the sky turned the color of tea. The boy didn't stay long, just enough to rest, to let the wool do its quiet work. Then he stood, didn't ask for the sock back, didn't mention coin, just nodded once, "Thanks," and limped back into the evening. Publius never saw him again, but the rest of the sock, the torn half that hadn't become a bandage, he kept, didn't sew it, didn't repurpose it, just folded it once, tucked it into the drawer where he kept things that had been brave. Because sometimes, wool is not just for warmth, it's for stopping pain, for quiet acts of mending, in a world full of sharp stones. And a sock, torn and tied, can hold more than just a foot. It can hold a wound, long enough to let it heal. It was frayed at the cuff, threadbare, barely holding together, too small to wear, too soft to throw away. Publius had placed it in the retired basket, a quiet little corner of the shop, where socks went to rest, not to be mended, but remembered. Then she arrived, a schoolteacher, older than most, with ink stains on her sleeves, and a voice that sounded like pages turning. She wasn't shopping for clothes, she'd come in looking for thread. But her eyes landed on the sock, the smallest one, the pale blue one, that once had belonged to someone forgotten. She picked it up, turned it in her hand, then asked, "May I?" Publius nodded. She slipped it into the pages of a scroll she carried, something about farming yields in Etruria. "It lays flatter than parchment," she said, smiling faintly, "and it never forgets the place I left off." She returned weeks later. Same scroll, same sock. She'd tied a bit of red thread to the cuff, so it peeked out when the scroll was rolled. "Best bookmark I've ever owned," she told him. "Smells like sleep and dust, and every time I open it, I feel calmer." She bought nothing else, didn't need to. That sock had found its second life. It never walked again, never touched a foot, but it traveled through pages, sat between words, pressed against ideas. It marked not just chapters, but moments of quiet. And Publius, whenever he thought of it, smiled at the thought, a sock, once made for walking, now helping others, not to lose their place. Because even when we stop moving, even when the path ends, there's still value in staying still and holding space for someone to return. The pillow wasn't fancy, just a square of linen, stuffed with soft things, old wool, dry straw, and quiet memories. But inside, at its center, hidden from view, was a single sock, worn, torn at the heel, but still fragrant with lavender and hearth smoke. It had belonged to a child, not recently, not for many years. Her mother had kept it, tucked it away in a cedar box, long after the child had grown, left, and built a life far from home. One winter, the mother came to Publius, clutching the sock in both hands. "She's having a baby," she said. "Her first." Publius looked down at the faded wool, the way it curled inward like a sleeping mouse. "I want her to have something soft," the woman continued, "but not new, something full." So they made a pillow, together. Publius stitched while she sat beside him, hands clasped tight, as if holding the years in place. He didn't wash the sock, didn't repair it. He folded it gently, wrapped it in cotton, and placed it at the pillow's heart. The child would never see it, would never know. But when the baby lay its head down for the first time, It would rest on the same softness that once cradled its mother's feet, and maybe, just maybe, some part of that comfort would carry through. A warmth passed from foot to pillow, from mother to child, from memory to breath. When the woman left, she kissed the pillow once, then walked slowly, cradling it like a story. And Publius, he kept the scrap of thread they'd cut away, tiny, grey, and quiet. Because some socks don't fade, they transform into gifts, into sleep, into something that softens even the newest cries. It began like many socks do, with a pair, dark green, sturdy wool, worn once then again, and again, until it softened to the shape of its owner's feet. Then, one day, only one returned. The owner stood in Publius's doorway, holding a single sock like a question. Left it at the baths, he said, or maybe the bakery, or the temple. Publius only smiled. Socks wander, he replied. Sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. The man shrugged and left, still wearing the lone remaining sock, paired with a mismatched cousin from his drawer. Weeks passed. Then, one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, a young girl arrived, holding something behind her back. I found this, she said, and produced the missing sock. A little scorched at the toe, smelled faintly of cinnamon and coal. Behind the bread ovens, she added, I thought it looked lonely. Publius laughed gently. You've reunited a brave traveler. He placed the sock beside its twin, let them rest together in the basket marked paired again. But the story didn't end there. A few days later, gone again. This time, no one knew where, no baker, no girl, no sign of mischief, just gone. Publius sighed, not out of frustration, but out of understanding. Some socks belong to the wind. They touch down, warm a foot, disappear into alleyways, only to reappear when they feel like being held again. That night, he left the other sock out on the sill, just in case. A candle flickering beside it, inviting its partner home, should it ever wish to return. Because some things, no matter how small, carry stories too restless to stay put. And maybe being lost is just another kind of journey. It was early spring, the kind of day when the wind still bites, but the earth begins to soften beneath your sandals. Publius had left a small pile of old socks on the window ledge to air out. Colors faded, fabric relaxed from years of wear. One in particular, a small ivory sock with a rounded toe and a tiny curled cuff, sat near the edge, fluffed just enough to look alive. A little boy wandered by, sticky fingers, gap-toothed smile, eyes always searching for something soft to love. He stopped, stared, gasped. A bunny. Before Publius could correct him, the child reached up with careful hands, scooped the sock into his arms, and cradled it like a newborn. He hummed to it, patted its non-existent ears, and whispered secrets into its threadbare wool. Publius opened his mouth, then closed it again. Instead of correcting the mistake, he stepped back. Let the magic live. The boy named it Pip, wrapped it in scraps of cloth, built it a nest from fig leaves and straw. When his mother came to fetch him, he held up the sock proudly. Found him. He was scared. I'm going to keep him warm. She looked at Publius, uncertain. He only nodded. It's his now. That evening, Publius stood by the window, looking at the empty space where the sock had sat. The ledge looked colder without it, but the thought of a child curled up beside his little woolen rabbit, whispering lullabies into soft yarn ears, that was warmth enough. Because sometimes, a sock doesn't need to be real. It only needs to be believed in. And in the quiet cradle of imagination, wool can become fur, toes can become noses, and love. Love can turn even the simplest things into something worth protecting. It wasn't part of the plan. No one includes socks in a wedding ceremony. Not in Rome, not anywhere. But this pair, soft white wool, tied gently with a strand of gold thread, had been carried in a pouch by the bride, quietly, secretly, not for fashion, not for show, but for memory. She'd worn them as a girl, during cold mornings in her family's old farmhouse. Her mother had stitched them by hand, humming as she worked, adding a tiny embroidered star just above the ankle. She'd long since outgrown them, but couldn't bear to throw them away. And so on the day of her wedding, she placed them beneath the altar stone before the guests arrived, tucked between wildflowers and olive leaves. They kept me warm, she whispered. Let them keep us warm now. No one noticed them during the vows. No one mentioned them in the feast that followed, but she knew. And later that night, as the couple sat by the fire, exhausted and glowing, she took the socks from beneath her cloak, laid them gently across their joined hands, "These," she said, "are the first things I ever owned that felt like love." Her husband didn't laugh, didn't ask questions. He only pressed his fingers to the faded star and said, "Then we'll keep them safe." Years later, they would show them to their child, small and soft, edges curling with time. Not as clothing, but as a promise. That warmth, once given, can be passed from one heart to another, even if it starts with nothing more than a pair of woolen socks. It was placed by the door one autumn morning, just one, folded neatly, facing outward, as if it expected someone to return. No one remembered who put it there. Maybe Publius, maybe a customer, maybe it simply appeared, like some things do, when longing takes shape. It sat on a small wooden stool, beside the walking cane that had no owner, and a coat hook that hadn't been used since spring. Dust gathered slowly. Seasons passed like whispered breath. Winter came and went, then another, then two more. Still, the sock remained. People began to notice. Children asked, "Is someone coming back for it?" Publius would only smile. Maybe. It became a quiet fixture, not decoration, more like a pause in wool. Some believed it belonged to a soldier who never came home. Others said it waited for a traveler who'd promised to return, but forgot the way. One older man, blind in one eye, claimed it waited for someone who'd never existed. "A memory in wool," he muttered. "That's all it is." But Publius never moved it. Even when he swept the floors, even when he rearranged the shelves, the sock stayed, a little more faded each year, its threads thinning, its shape folding inward, like someone asleep in a chair. Then one spring morning, just as the first swallows returned, it was gone. No one had seen who took it. No note, no sign, only the empty stool, bathed in early light. And somehow, it felt right, as if whatever it had waited for had finally arrived. Or perhaps it had grown tired of waiting and decided to go looking. Publius didn't replace it, left the stool bare, let the space breathe again. Because sometimes, a sock doesn't need to be found. It only needs to hold the waiting, to sit quietly by the door until the story it carried was ready to leave. He came just after dawn, carrying nothing but silence. No bag, no coin pouch, only a look in his eyes. That said something was ending. Publius recognized it. He'd seen it before, in those who came not to buy, but to let go. The man stood quietly, then pointed to a pair near the window. Simple grey socks, thin, but warm, nothing special, except they were his size. He didn't try them on, didn't ask for a wrapping, just paid, held them gently, and said, "I need to say goodbye to someone who isn't here." Publius nodded. "Then wear these," he replied. Softness helps when the words are heavy. The man left. Publius watched him disappear down the lane, feet wrapped in new wool, steps slow and deliberate. Later that evening, a note appeared under the door. No name, just a few words. "I sat beneath her tree. I told her everything. The socks kept me grounded. Thank you." Publius folded the note, slipped it between the pages of his ledger, and he lit a small oil lamp beside the shop's hearth, a quiet flame, for a quiet farewell. Because not every goodbye is loud, not every parting comes with tears. Sometimes it comes in the form of a walk, a whisper, a pair of socks wrapped around sore feet, helping someone carry the weight of words, finally spoken. They were repairing the back wall of an old tavern. Stone cracked from years of wind and laughter, wine spills and winter chills. As the mason chipped away the plaster, he paused. Something soft had slipped into view. Not dust, not straw, cloth. He pulled gently. Out came a small woolen sock, curled tight, discolored with time, but whole. Tucked deep between two bricks, sealed away by someone long gone. The workers passed it around, laughing at first, but something about it felt sacred. They brought it to Publius, wrapped in linen, like it had just woken from a long sleep. He turned it in his hands, soft, worn, faintly scented with rosemary and soot. No one knew who put it there, or why. But in Rome, old builders sometimes hid small objects in walls, charms, wishes, protection, a blessing, someone whispered. Perhaps a mother, tucking a symbol of warmth into stone, hoping her child's footsteps would always return. Or maybe a builder, hiding a piece of his own clothing, so part of him would remain in the place he helped build. Publius didn't clean it, didn't place it for sale. He kept it on a shelf near the door, between a dried orange peel and a box of chalk. A reminder that even the strongest walls sometimes need something soft at their center, and that warmth, true warmth, can outlast brick, outlast memory, even outlast the hands that placed it. A sock, buried in silence, whispering across centuries, I was here, and I cared. It was a night when the moon hung low, a glowing lantern in the velvet sky. The air was crisp, and shadows stretched long and thin across the quiet streets of Rome. A young woman walked alone, carrying a small bundle wrapped in linen. Inside, her mother's favorite pair of socks, worn thin, frayed at the edges, soft as whispered memories. She reached the top of the hill, where the temple of Luna stood silent. She knelt and placed the bundle carefully on the stone altar, her hands trembling. She whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for the mother who had passed that winter, whose feet never grew warm again. Then, under the silver light, she lifted the socks to the sky, as if offering them to the moon itself. Some say the moon took them, wrapped them in its cold light, carried them across the heavens to keep her mother's feet warm, where earthly warmth could no longer reach. Others say the socks simply faded, absorbed into the night, leaving behind only the scent of lavender and loss. Publius heard the story from a traveler months later. He smiled softly, imagining the woolen offering, drifting among stars. Because sometimes, when words fail, we give what we can, even if it's only a pair of socks left in silence beneath the moon. The fishing boat was small, rocking gently on the Tiber's slow current, its wood worn smooth by salt and time, its sails patched with care. A fisherman, weathered and silent, prepared his nets as dawn's first light painted the sky. He wore sturdy sandals, but on this morning, he found one sock, soft wool, frayed cuff, left behind, forgotten on the pier. He tucked it into his coat pocket, not knowing why, not needing to. The day was long, the nets heavy, the river cold, but when the fisherman paused, he pulled out the lone sock, warmed his hands, pressed it gently to his cheek. It smelled of home. At sunset, as the boat drifted back, he laid the sock on the prow, let the wind catch its loose threads, and whispered thanks for the small comfort it had brought. Publius never knew who left the sock, nor where the other had gone, but the sock stayed. It caught the salt spray, tasted the sun, and waited for feet to come back. Because sometimes, socks are not just for walking, they're for holding on to places we might lose when the tides take us far away. In a quiet corner of the Athenaeum, between stacks of ancient scrolls, a librarian uncovered something unexpected. A sock, not just any sock, but a tiny folded piece of wool, soft and faded, tucked inside the pages of a dusty manuscript. Curious, she brought it to Publius. He traced the threads with reverent fingers, recognized the careful stitches, the slight imperfection near the toe. It's mine, he whispered. The sock held a secret. Inside the cuff, a small parchment, a poem written in hurried ink. When knowledge chills your bones, wrap warmth round your heart. The librarian smiled. She wrapped the sock carefully in cloth, kept it beside the scroll, and when cold evenings came, she pressed it to her cheek, feeling the soft embrace of woolen words. Because sometimes, warmth is not just for feet, it's for the soul. It came with a bundle of letters, sealed with wax and tied with twine. A messenger left it at Publius's door. No name, no address. Among the folded parchments, nestled inside a leather pouch, was a small, worn sock, soft brown wool, faded to the color of autumn leaves. Publius unfolded the sock carefully, feeling the roughness of years past. Inside, sewn into the lining, was a tiny folded note. It read, "If you find this, know that I walked these roads thinking of you." No signature, no further words. Publius held the sock for a long time, then placed it in the window, where the light caught its worn edges and the thread that bound it. Days passed. No one claimed it, but the story lingered, of a traveler carrying love and longing, wrapped in woolen paper, moving silently through Rome's streets. Because sometimes, messages don't need words. Sometimes, they live in the quiet weight of a sock. It was not a proud moment for Publius. He watched, somewhat amused and puzzled, as a young apprentice approached the workshop, carrying a dusty statue of Mercury. The statue had been neglected, coated in centuries of grime, its bronze dull and tired. The apprentice, eager to help, asked for a cloth. Publius pointed to a basket of old socks, those that were too worn to wear, too soft to toss. The apprentice chose one, a faded red pair, threadbare and patchy, but full of years of care. He dipped it in water, then began to rub. The sock, surprisingly gentle, lifted the dust and soot, revealing the glint of bronze beneath. Publius chuckled softly. Not many would think of socks as cleaning tools, but he understood. Sometimes, what is worn and tired is exactly what is needed to bring out the shine in forgotten things. The apprentice worked late into the afternoon, turning the sock this way and that, smiling at the light that returned. When finished, he thanked Publius and left the sock on the workshop table. Publius didn't use it for socks again. Instead, he kept it, soft, stained, and full of new purpose. Because sometimes, a sock's greatest gift is not on the foot, but in the hands that hold it. The market was crowded that day. Vendors shouted. Children ran between stalls. The air was thick with spices, sweat, and dust. A merchant's wife had come to Publius's shop, looking for socks to replace a pair lost somewhere amid the chaos. She described them, woolen, faded brown, with a tiny tear near the heel. Publius nodded, understanding. But the market was a labyrinth. Socks slipped between legs, ducked beneath carts, and disappeared into pockets, or the pockets of others. Days passed, and the lost socks were nowhere to be found. Then, one morning, a boy appeared at Publius's door, holding a single sock, brown, torn, but still soft. He said he'd found it near the fountain, caught on a statue's foot. Publius smiled. He gave the boy a small coin and a new pair, not to replace the lost ones, but to remind him that sometimes things lost have a way of finding new life. And the old sock, it hung on a peg in the shop, a little tattered trophy of the market's wild dance. Because in a city like Rome, even a sock can have adventures. One morning, just as the sun stretched its first golden fingers across the rooftops, a stranger appeared at Publius's door. Clad in worn robes, eyes deep with stories, and hands that trembled slightly from cold. He said little, just offered a small bundle, wrapped in cloth, tied with a piece of leather. Inside, a pair of socks, not new, not finely sewn, but warm and full of care. I made these, the stranger whispered, for those who need them more than I. Publius accepted the gift with a nod. No questions, no thanks. From that day, the socks sat by the shop's hearth, waiting for the right feet to find them, and they did. Feet that were tired, cold, unseen. People who came quietly, but left with warmth wrapped around their souls. Publius never learned the stranger's name, nor where he went next, but his gift, a simple pair of socks, passed on without fanfare, became a thread of kindness woven into the fabric of the city. Because sometimes, the warmest gifts come from hands unknown and hearts unspoken. It began as a failed pair. One sock with a hole large enough to see the floor beneath. The other, missing entirely. No customer wanted it. No child claimed it. Publius almost tossed it into the fire. But then a boy came running in. Eyes bright, cheeks flushed from play. He spotted the lone sock, grabbed it with enthusiasm, and asked, "Can I make a puppet?" Publius smiled. With no hesitation, the boy stuffed straw into the opening, used scraps of cloth for eyes and mouth, and tied a thin leather strap for a tongue. He named it Woolly. The puppet danced across the shop floor, singing silly songs, wiggling fingers and toes in ways no sock had ever moved before. Customers laughed, workers smiled, Publius watched quietly. From then on, the sock found new life, not as footwear, but as a friend. Woolly the puppet accompanied the boy through many days, hidden in pockets, perched on shoulders, and always ready for a new adventure. And Publius? He made another puppet the next day, then another, because sometimes, even when socks fail at their first purpose, they can still bring warmth to hearts and hands alike. Deep beneath the city, where shadows lingered longer than light, and silence told stories, the living forgot, lay a tomb. Inside, among relics of forgotten lives, was a single sock, not worn, not torn, but carefully folded, placed as if it were a precious offering. Archaeologists would find it centuries later, a threadbare mystery, stitched with care. No one knew who had left it there. No one knew why. Perhaps a mourner had wanted to bring comfort to the dead, or a family had placed it as a symbol of home, a reminder of warmth beyond the grave. Publius imagined it as a message, soft, folded, silent, that even in the darkest places where time and dust reign, a sock, small and humble, could hold a spark of memory. It waited there, unseen by the world, but full of meaning. Because sometimes, what we leave behind is not gold or glory. It is the softest stitch, the gentlest gift, the quietest warmth. And sometimes, that is enough. It was said that no one returned from the underworld without the protection of something soft, something familiar, something that felt like home. A man, brave and burdened, prepared for his descent. He carried a staff, a lantern, and the last pair of socks his mother had knit. Woolen, thick, worn with love and patience. He put them on carefully, feeling the warmth against his skin. A small shield against the cold of death. The journey was long, filled with shadows and whispers, the river's mist curling around his feet. But the socks held strong. They cushioned his steps, absorbed the damp chill, and reminded him of sunlit mornings long past. When he emerged, pale but unbroken, he left the socks at the temple's altar, an offering of thanks. Publius later heard the tale, from a traveler who claimed to have seen the altar and the worn wool lying there. It was more than a sock. It was a talisman, a promise that even in the darkest places, warmth could be found and carried. In a small corner of the market, two young lovers met secretly. He was a builder's son, she a seamstress. Words were scarce. Eyes spoke more than lips. One day before parting for a long journey, he handed her a single sock, soft wool, dyed deep blue, embroidered with a tiny silver thread. "It's not much," he said, "but it's mine, and it's yours now." She clutched it close, a promise made without words. For months she wore the sock, folded in her pocket, kept safe beneath layers of cloth. Every time she touched it, she remembered his hands, his smile, his silent vow to return. When he finally came back, scarred but alive, she gave him back the sock, and he smiled, knowing some promises are held not by speech, but by threads. It was a busy morning. The market was alive with noise and color. Publius was weaving through crowds, carrying a bundle of freshly stitched socks. A customer handed him a worn leather bag, asking to have a pair of socks repaired. Publius tucked the bag under his arm, set to work. Days passed. The bag stayed by the door, quiet, waiting. Until one afternoon, a young woman appeared. She claimed the bag. Inside, she found a single sock, not hers. Soft grey, faded in places. She asked Publius about it. He shrugged. No idea where it came from. The sock had been forgotten, lost in the shuffle. But sometimes, lost things find new homes. The woman took the sock, kept it in her cloak pocket, wore it as a reminder that even forgotten things can carry warmth, waiting to be found again. In the maze of narrow alleys, where shadows clung to stone, two friends needed a way to communicate, without words, without drawing attention. One had a pair of socks, brightly dyed red, patterned with stripes of gold. They decided on a signal. If the sock hung from a window, it meant safe. If it waved from a balcony, it meant come quickly. Publius didn't know the details, only that for weeks those socks danced in the breeze, messengers in wool. One night, under the silver gaze of the moon, the socks disappeared. No note, no warning, but the friends met safely the next day. Publius heard the tale days later. He smiled, because socks, sometimes, carry more than warmth. They carry trust, messages sown in silence. He was known for his words, soft, sharp, and weaving through the streets like smoke. A poet with calloused hands, and feet that bore the weight of many journeys. Publius first noticed him sitting by the forum, eyes closed, murmuring verses to the wind. When the poet visited the shop, he asked not for fine wool, but for simple socks, unassuming, worn, soft enough to carry dreams. He wore them everywhere, to the markets, to quiet gardens, to taverns where songs were born. The socks became part of his story. He spoke of them in verses, calling them shoes for the soul. Publius never claimed a coin for them, because some socks are not just fabric. They are companions on the road of inspiration, walking beside the feet that carry words into the world. The fire crackled low, its amber glow dancing against the stone walls. The hearth was warm, but the air outside held a chill. A traveler had stopped by Publius's shop, seeking refuge from the cold night. He carried a worn satchel and a single sock, torn, faded, but still holding the scent of faraway lands. He placed the sock by the fire, carefully. "Not mine anymore," he said softly. "Left behind in the rush." Publius nodded. The traveler stayed only briefly, then disappeared into the night. The sock remained. For weeks, it lay by the hearth, warming the room with memories, waiting to be claimed. But no one came, so Publius wrapped it in linen and placed it on a shelf. a reminder that sometimes what is lost can become a quiet gift left behind for others to find. Keys in Rome were precious, heavy, cold, and often too large to carry easily. So clever people found clever ways to hide them. A man came to Publius one afternoon, eyes darting nervously. "I need a sock," he whispered, "not for wearing, for hiding." Publius raised an eyebrow. The man explained, "A key to a place I must protect, and I can't risk losing it." Publius selected a thick dark wool sock, double-stitched the heel, and carefully fashioned a hidden pocket inside. The man smiled, paid quickly, and left. Weeks later, Publius found a note slipped under his door. The key was safe, thanks to the sock. No name, no return, just gratitude. Because sometimes, a sock is more than warmth. It's a secret keeper, a guardian of what matters most. It was an old tradition. Long before paper was common, messages were wrapped in cloth, protected by fabric soft and sturdy. A woman came to Publius's shop, requesting a simple wool sock, plain, unadorned, but strong. She had a letter to send, not just any letter, one filled with words too precious to risk damage. Publius crafted the sock carefully, making the fabric tight enough to shield the contents, soft enough to keep secrets safe. The woman folded the letter inside, tied the sock with a thin leather cord, and sent it on its way. Days later, she returned, thankful and relieved. The letter had arrived unharmed. Publius smiled quietly, knowing that sometimes a sock's greatest role is as a protector, holding the fragile things close. Not every sock is made for feet. Some become the first companions, soft and safe, for small hands learning the world. A mother came to Publius with a daughter just beginning to walk. She asked for a sock, not too big, not too small, but full of comfort. Publius chose the softest wool, light as clouds, and stitched it with care. He added no seams that might prick, no rough edges, just smooth loops of warmth. The child took it immediately, clutching it like a treasure. She tossed it, caught it, hid it in her cradle. The sock became a toy, a pillow, a blanket, and sometimes a secret hiding place. The mother returned weeks later, grateful for the small gift. Publius watched the child grow, sock always close at hand, a silent guardian of first steps and first dreams. Because sometimes a sock is more than fabric. It's love woven tight, the road stretched endlessly before him. Dust and stone beneath tired feet, sun blazing high, then dipping low into the horizon. He had left the city weeks ago, carrying little but hope and a single pair of socks. Not new, not perfect, but strong, woven with care by Publius himself. Those socks bore the weight of miles, absorbed the dust of distant villages, held warmth through cold nights under the stars. Along the way they frayed, became softer, more familiar. Each step brought him closer to home, to the hearth waiting for him, to the faces he missed most. When he finally returned, his feet were worn, but his socks, though ragged, were filled with the story of his journey. Publius greeted him silently, knowing that sometimes the longest roads are measured not in miles, but in the footsteps that carry us back. In a quiet corner of Publius's shop, there sits a sock, unlike any other. Worn thin in places, repaired more times than can be counted, faded beyond recognition, but still whole. It's the sock that has traveled through centuries of hands, heard whispers of joy and sorrow, felt the weight of countless steps, and carried more stories than any scroll. It holds the laughter of children, the tears of the grieving, the hope of lovers, and the silence of those who walked alone. Every stitch is a memory, every thread, a tale. Publius looks at it and smiles, knowing this simple piece of wool is more than fabric. It is a keeper of history, a vessel of warmth, a silent witness to lives lived in the softest of ways. And as the world moves ever faster, as feet rush on new paths, the sock remains, a quiet reminder that beneath every journey, no matter how small, there is a story worth telling. So when you think of a sock, think not just of warmth, but of the countless lives it has touched, the roads it has traveled, and the gentle threads that bind us all together. Because in the end, every sock holds a story, waiting patiently for someone to listen. Thank you so much, and good night.